What does it mean to be the most remembered person who was never meant to be remembered at all? In the white-hot stillness of the eastern desert, where the Nile bends sharply between the cliffs at a place once called Akhetaten, the sand has been moving for more than 3,000 years. It does not move quickly. It moves the way the desert always moves, one grain at a time, settling into the cracks of stones that were carved by hands no one alive can name. Beneath that sand, the foundations of a city remain. Beneath those foundations, fragments of plaster still carry the faint outline of a face. The face was beautiful. The face was famous. The face was supposed to be gone. The wind picks up just before sunrise. It carries the dry smell of salt and burned limestone, and the older, stranger smell that lives only in places where stone has been broken open by human tools and then left alone for thousands of years. The sun crests the cliffs. The light moves across the plain in a slow advancing line. It touches the broken edges of what used to be a temple. It touches a doorway that no longer opens onto anything. It touches the shoulder of a sandstone block that once formed part of a wall, and on that block, faintly, almost invisible to the eye, the curve of a queen's profile can still be traced if the angle of the morning light is exactly right. Someone, 33 centuries ago, climbed a ladder and used a small bronze chisel to cut that face out of the stone. The work was patient, the work was thorough, the hands that did it were not angry. They were paid. They were following orders. Whoever held that chisel was almost certainly told what to do by a man whose name was almost certainly written down somewhere else. And that man was told what to do by another man, and behind all of them was a state that had decided that this queen should not be remembered. The state failed. The face is still here. Her name is spoken on every continent on Earth. Her image is reproduced on coffee mugs and museum brochures and the covers of textbooks read by children who will never visit Egypt. Her bust sits in a glass case in a museum in Berlin, and roughly 500,000 people walk past it every year. She is, by almost any measure, one of the most successfully remembered human beings in history, and yet no one knows where her body is. No one knows when she died, or how. No one knows what her last title was, or what she was called in the final years of her life, or whether she ruled Egypt in her own right after her husband's death, or whether she was already buried by then in some chamber that has never been found. The record of her life simply stops, partway through, like a sentence broken off in the middle of a word. The hands that came after did not finish that sentence. They did the opposite. They went back through everything she had said and tried to take it apart. This is the story of how that effort began, and what it accomplished, and why, after more than 3,000 years of chiseling and demolishing and burying and forgetting, the woman called Nefertiti is still standing somewhere in the desert, just out of reach of the radar. To understand what was done to her, it is necessary to begin in a world that did not yet know it was about to be changed. The reign that produced Nefertiti, the court that raised her, and the dynasty whose collapse would orbit around her absence were already, by ancient standards, very old. The Egypt of the 18th dynasty, in the second half of the 14th century before the Common Era, was not a young civilization. It was a state that had been continuously administered, more or less, for almost 2,000 years. The pyramids at Giza were already older than the cathedrals of Europe are today. The pharaohs of the early Old Kingdom, the men who had built those pyramids, were as remote to a New Kingdom Egyptian as the Roman emperors are remote to a modern reader. Egypt had buried its own ancient past several times over by the time Nefertiti was born. The pharaoh on the throne, at the moment of her birth, was a man called Amenhotep III. He had ruled for almost 4 decades. He was, by the standards of any age, an enormously wealthy king. His Egypt controlled gold mines in the eastern desert, and in Nubia. His Egypt extracted tribute from vassal states stretching from the Euphrates to the 4th cataract of the Nile. His Egypt sent emissaries to the kings of Babylon, and the Hittites and the rulers of Cyprus and Crete, and the letters they wrote to each other, preserved on baked clay tablets, survive in fragments to this day. In those letters, the foreign kings beg for gold. They write that in Egypt, gold is as common as dust. The phrase recurs again and again. Egypt has so much gold, the foreign kings complain, that the pharaoh hardly notices when he sends them a few crates of it as a wedding present. The court of Amenhotep III was the most luxurious in the world. It was housed in a palace complex on the western bank of the Nile, opposite the great religious capital at Thebes, in a district known as Malkata. The palace floors were painted with images of fish and reeds and ducks, executed in tempera so fine that fragments of the paint still hold their color where modern excavators have lifted them out of the dust. The walls were plastered and painted with court scenes. The ceilings were beamed in imported cedar from Lebanon, fastened with gold rivets. The king's harem occupied entire wings of the complex. His chief queen, a woman named Tiye, was a foreigner of some kind, possibly the daughter of a provincial official from a town in Middle Egypt called Akhmim, and possibly of mixed Nubian descent. She was unusual for an Egyptian queen in that she was depicted at almost the same scale as her husband on official monuments, and she was given a level of public political prominence that no royal woman before her had enjoyed. The pharaoh's correspondence to foreign kings sometimes mentioned her by name. The foreign kings wrote back to her directly. This was something new. In the household of Queen Tiye, in the small town of Akhmim, or in the great palace at Malkata, or somewhere in between, a girl was born sometime in the early 14th century before the Common Era. Her parents are unknown, her place of birth is unknown, her childhood is unknown. The first time her name appears in the historical record, she is already an adolescent, and she is already married to the son of the pharaoh, the crown prince Amenhotep, the boy who would soon become Akhenaten, and who would within a few short years take the entire religious and political structure of Egypt apart and rebuild it around himself and around her. Her name was Nefertiti. In the language of her time, it meant, approximately, the beautiful one has come. The phrase implies arrival from somewhere else. It suggests, without confirming, that she may not have been originally of the royal household, but rather a girl brought in from outside it, presented to the court, and given to the prince. Egyptologists have argued for more than a century about who she was before that arrival. The leading theory, held by many but proven by none, is that she was the daughter of a man named Ai, a high official at the court of Amenhotep III, who held the title of God's father, and who would much later, in the chaos after her own family had collapsed, briefly become pharaoh himself. Ai was almost certainly the brother of Queen Tiye. If he was Nefertiti's father, then Nefertiti was the queen's niece, married to the queen's son, which would have made her a cousin to her own husband. This kind of close family arrangement was not unusual in the Egyptian royal house. The royal blood was understood to be a divine substance, and the easiest way to keep it pure was to keep it circulating within the family. A competing theory, less popular but still defended by serious scholars, holds that Nefertiti was a foreign princess, possibly the Mitanni princess named Tadukipa, who was known to have been sent to the Egyptian court as a bride for Amenhotep III late in his reign, and who may have been transferred to the harem of the young Amenhotep IV after the old king's death. The arguments for this theory rest mainly on the meaning of her name and on the unusual prominence she would later achieve, which some scholars take as a sign that she was a high-status foreign import rather than a homegrown court daughter. The arguments against it rest on the fact that no Egyptian source ever calls her a foreigner, and that the title most commonly associated with her, Mistress of the Two Lands, is one that an Egyptian queen would naturally hold, while a foreign-born consort would more typically be marked with some indication of her origin. Neither theory can be proven. The girl who arrived at the court of the prince in the late years of Amenhotep III's reign appears in the record fully formed, already married, already adult, already in possession of a face and a presence that would become, over the next 2 decades, the most reproduced image of any woman in the ancient world. The marriage took place at Thebes, in the great religious capital of southern Egypt, in the shadow of the temple complex at Karnak, which had been built and rebuilt by every pharaoh for centuries. Karnak was sacred to the god Amun, the Hidden One, the chief deity of the 18th dynasty. Amun's priesthood was the wealthiest and most powerful institution in Egypt, outside of the royal household itself. The priests of Amun controlled vast tracts of farmland. They administered estates, they collected tithes, they mediated between the pharaoh and the divine. The relationship between the priesthood and the throne was, in theory, one of harmonious cooperation. In practice, by the time Nefertiti arrived at the court, it had been growing tense for at least a generation. The old king, Amenhotep III, had begun to emphasize a slightly different version of the sun god, a more abstract and more inclusive form, possibly as a deliberate counterweight to the power of the Amun priesthood. He had built temples to this newer form of the solar god at various sites along the Nile. He had begun to refer to himself, in some inscriptions, as the dazzling sun disk. The trend was modest. Nothing about it suggested the explosion that was coming, but the ground was being prepared. Amenhotep IV came to the throne sometime in the late 1350s before the Common Era. The exact date is disputed. Some scholars place his accession in the year 1353, others argue for 1351 or 1350. The disagreement reflects an underlying uncertainty about whether or not he ruled jointly with his father for a number of years before becoming sole pharaoh. The evidence for a long co-regency is suggestive but not conclusive. The evidence against it is also suggestive but not conclusive. The argument has been running for more than 100 years and shows no sign of being resolved. What is certain is that within a few years of his accession, the new pharaoh did something no king of Egypt had ever done before. He changed his name. The name Amenhotep meant Amen is satisfied. It contained, embedded within it, the name of the chief god of the Egyptian state, the god whose priesthood had grown so wealthy and so powerful, the god whose temple at Karnak was the largest religious structure in the known world. To change his name was to renounce that god. To replace the element Amen with the element Aten was to declare publicly that the king's primary loyalty had shifted. The Aten was the visible disk of the sun. It was not a hidden god. It was not represented as a human or as an animal. It was simply the disk itself, with rays extending downward, each ray ending in a small human hand that offered the symbol of life to whoever stood beneath it. The Aten had no priesthood with centuries of accumulated wealth. The Aten had no entrenched institutional interests. The Aten was, in effect, a god the king could control. The name change was made official sometime around the 5th year of the new pharaoh's reign. From that point forward, the king was called Akhenaten, which meant approximately effective for the Aten, or one who is useful to the Aten. The queen took a parallel new name. She added the element Nefer-Neferutin to the front of her name, which meant beautiful are the beauties of the Aten. Her full name from that point onward was Nefer-Neferutin Nefertiti. Both names invoked the Aten. Both names announced, to anyone who could read them, that the holders had aligned themselves with a god other than the chief god of the Egyptian state. The decision was not popular. There is no direct evidence of what the priests of Amun thought of it, because the priests of Amun did not leave behind their private correspondence on the matter. But there is indirect evidence. Within a few years of the name change, the king began to close the temples of Amun. He had the name of the old god chiseled off monuments throughout Egypt. He had the plural word for gods removed from inscriptions, leaving only the singular. He had the names of other deities, particularly the war god Montu and the household goddess Mut, defaced as well. He sent agents into the temples of the Nile Valley with orders to scrape the names of the displaced gods from every surface they could reach. This was not the work of an absent-minded reformer. This was a systematic, state-organized effort to take an entire religious system apart. It was, in other words, an erasure. The first great erasure of the Amarna period was not the one that would later be inflicted on Nefertiti. It was the one that she and her husband inflicted on the gods of their own country. The pattern that would be turned against her was first established by her. The hands that would later climb ladders to chisel her face out of the stones at Amarna were doing nothing that her own agents had not first done to the temples of Amun, of Mut, of Montu, of every god whose name conflicted with the new monotheism of the disk. Whether Nefertiti herself was the architect of this religious revolution, or merely its most prominent supporter, has been debated for over a century. The evidence is suggestive in both directions. She appears in the early reliefs at Karnak, performing the rituals of the Aten cult alongside her husband, sometimes at the same scale, sometimes given her own independent scenes in which she officiates without him. She is shown wearing the tall blue crown that no previous queen had worn. She is shown driving a chariot, which is the kind of activity normally reserved for kings. She is shown in the so-called smiting scene, in which the pharaoh, traditionally, raises a mace above the head of a kneeling foreign captive and prepares to bring it down. In the version of this scene that survives from Amarna, the figure raising the mace is not the king, it is the queen. No previous Egyptian queen had ever been depicted in this way. The smiting scene was not symbolic decoration. It was the most concentrated visual expression of pharaonic power in the entire vocabulary of Egyptian art. To put a queen in that position, holding a mace above the skull of a kneeling enemy, was to make a statement about the nature of her authority. She was not merely a consort, she was something closer to an equal. She was, possibly, something more than that. The decision to leave Thebes came in the 5th or 6th year of Akhenaten's reign. The new pharaoh had been ruling from the old religious capital, surrounded by the temples of the gods he was systematically dismantling, and the situation must have become impossible. The Amun priesthood, even if it could no longer worship its god openly, was still housed in its old quarters at Karnak, still administered its estates, still represented an institutional center of resistance. To break free of it, Akhenaten decided to build himself a new capital. He would build it from nothing, on virgin ground, on a site that no other god had ever claimed. He sent surveyors up and down the Nile Valley until they found a suitable location, roughly halfway between Thebes and Memphis, on the eastern bank of the river, in a broad natural amphitheater enclosed by cliffs. The site had no previous occupation. It had no temples, no shrines, no resident priesthood. It was empty desert, bounded on the west by the river and on the east by a curving line of pale yellow cliffs. It was perfect. He called the new city Akhetaten, which meant Horizon of the Aten. The modern name for the site, derived from the nearby village, is Amarna. Construction began immediately. Tens of thousands of workers were brought in. The court was relocated within a few years. The royal family moved into a sprawling palace complex at the center of the new city, surrounded by the residences of officials, the workshops of artisans, the barracks of soldiers, and the houses of ordinary citizens who had been transplanted along with their king. The new temples of the Aten were built without roofs, so that the disk of the sun could shine directly into the sanctuaries. The new tombs of the elite were cut into the cliffs east of the city, oriented so that the rising sun would strike their entrances first. The whole city was designed around the daily movement of the sun across the sky. Around the perimeter of this new capital, Akhenaten ordered the carving of a series of inscriptions known as the boundary stelae. There were 16 of them in total. They were cut into the cliffs at the edges of the city's defined territory, like markers in stone declaring the limits of a kingdom within a kingdom. The texts of the boundary stelae are remarkable. They describe the king's vision for his new capital. They record his oath that he would never leave it. They describe, in considerable detail, the religious philosophy of the Aten cult, the daily rituals to be performed in the new temples, and the king's personal devotion to the god of the disk. They also, almost incidentally, mention Nefertiti. They mention her many times. They name her as the great royal wife. They name her as the mother of the king's daughters. They name her as the one who pleases the Aten by her voice. The repetition of her name across these monumental inscriptions is striking. No previous queen had been embedded so thoroughly into the founding documents of a royal capital. Her presence in those texts is not decorative, it is structural. The new city, in the boundary stelae, is described as belonging to both of them. By the 8th or 9th year of Akhenaten's reign, the new capital was largely complete, and the royal family was firmly settled there. The temples of the Aten were operational. The court ceremonies had been rebuilt around the new theology. The walls of the palaces and the chapels of the elite were being painted and carved with images of the king, the queen, and their children in a style of art that had never been seen before in Egypt. The traditional formal style of pharaonic representation, which had governed royal imagery for over 1,000 years, had been broken open. In its place was something stranger, looser, more intimate. The king was shown with an elongated skull, a long jaw, narrow shoulders, a swollen belly, and feminine hips. The queen was shown similarly distorted, though usually less extremely. The royal daughters were shown with hugely elongated craniums and slender, almost insectile limbs. The official sculpture of the period rendered the royal family as something not quite human, not quite divine, hovering in between the categories that the older art had been so careful to keep separate. Scholars have argued for over a century about what this new style meant. Some have suggested that it depicted the king and his family as they actually looked, and that Akhenaten and his children may have suffered from one or more genetic disorders, including possibly Marfan syndrome or some related condition that produces the kind of skeletal elongation visible in the art. Others have argued that the style was purely ideological, a deliberate departure from the old norms designed to express the new theology in visual form. Still others have suggested that it was a kind of religious allegory, with the king depicted as an androgynous figure to express the idea that the Aten contained within itself both masculine and feminine principles. The debate has not been resolved. What is certain is that the new style produced some of the most distinctive and recognizable images in the entire corpus of Egyptian art, and that one of those images, the painted limestone bust of Nefertiti, found in 1912 in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose, would eventually become the most reproduced image of any ancient Egyptian who ever lived. The bust was made, almost certainly, during this middle phase of the Amarna period, when the city was at its peak and the queen was at the height of her visible power. It was found in the workshop of the chief sculptor, abandoned on a shelf, along with several other plaster heads and a quantity of unused stone. The sculptor had been working on it as a study, a model from which other portraits of the queen could be made. It had not been intended for public display. It had been intended as a reference object, a master copy. The face it presents is calm, balanced, alert, almost ageless. The eyes are set deep beneath the strong brow. The mouth is closed, but not pressed shut. The cheekbones are high, the neck is long. The famous, tall, flat-topped crown rises above the head in a continuous sweep of painted blue. One of the eyes is incomplete. The inlay of crystal and beeswax that would have filled the left socket is missing, possibly because it was never installed, possibly because it was deliberately removed during the working process, so that the sculptor could practice his technique on the more difficult right side and leave the left for later. The asymmetry of the unfinished face is part of what makes it so haunting. It is a queen with one eye that sees and one eye that does not. The bust would not be excavated for more than 3,000 years. While it sat undisturbed in the sand of the abandoned workshop, the rest of the city around it would be dismantled, burned, dispersed, scavenged, forgotten, rediscovered, and eventually placed under the protection of the modern Egyptian state. But in the years when the bust was being made, in the middle decade of Akhenaten's reign, no one yet knew that the city would be abandoned. Everyone in Amarna believed, or behaved as if they believed, that the new capital would stand forever. The king had sworn an oath on the boundary stele that he would never leave. The queen had sworn the same. The children had been born into the new theology. The artisans had been trained in the new style. The whole vast experiment had achieved a kind of equilibrium. The daily life of the city in those middle years had a rhythm that has been partially reconstructed from the archaeological record. The day began before dawn. The workmen who labored in the temple complexes and on the palace grounds walked the long path from the workmen's village in the eastern hills down to the central city in the gray hour before the sun rose. The village itself was small, walled, and tightly organized. The houses were arranged in regular rows, sharing walls, each one consisting of 3 small rooms opening off a central corridor. There was a single gate. There was no internal source of water. The workmen carried water in on their backs from supply stations in the hills outside the village, and they carried out their refuse in the same way. The arrangement was practical. It was also designed to keep the workmen separated from the main population of the city, both for the convenience of the authorities and possibly for the protection of secrets relating to the construction of the royal tombs. The artisans of the workshops, the painters and sculptors, and metal workers lived in larger and more comfortable houses scattered through the southern district of the central city. Their homes had courtyards, gardens, and small private chapels in which the family could perform daily acts of devotion. The chapels usually contained, as their central focus, a stela depicting the royal family beneath the rays of the Aten. The family of the artisan, before beginning the day's work, would bow before the image of the king and the queen and recite the prescribed prayers. The food prepared in the kitchen would be presented first at the household chapel before being eaten. The wine poured at the evening meal would be sprinkled first as an offering. The household religion of Amarna had been completely reorganized around the royal family. In the central city, the great temples opened at dawn. The king and the queen, accompanied by their daughters and by a small entourage of priests and attendants, would arrive at the gates of the great Aten temple as the first light fell across the river. They would proceed along the central avenue between the rows of altars. The morning service consisted of a long sequence of offerings. Bread loaves were placed on the altars. Bouquets of fresh-cut flowers, gathered from the gardens of the palace at first light, were arranged in conical heaps. Jars of beer and wine were poured out at designated stations. The musicians played sistra, harps, and double pipes. The king sang the prescribed hymns. The queen sang the responses. The daughters, the older ones, joined in. The whole ceremony lasted several hours. The sun climbed slowly above the eastern cliffs, the temple filled with the slanting morning light. The rays of the disk, as represented in the carved reliefs that covered the walls, descended from above and offered the symbol of life to whoever stood beneath them. The ceremony ended when the sun had cleared the top of the cliffs and the full heat of the day had begun to settle over the open courts. The royal daughters in the middle years of the city's life had been 6. Their names were Meritaten, Meketaten, Onkesenpaten, Neferneferuaten, Tasheret, Neferneferur, and Setepenre. The eldest, Meritaten, had been born early in the reign and was already an adolescent by the time the city was at its peak. She is depicted in many of the surviving reliefs, standing beside her mother, sometimes holding a younger sister by the hand. She would eventually be married, in the late years of the reign, or shortly afterward, to a man named Smenkhkare, who briefly held some kind of royal position during the troubled transition that followed Akhenaten's death. The exact nature of Smenkhare's role and the duration of his marriage to Meritaten are among the many unresolved questions of the late Amarna period. Meketaten, the second daughter, was the first of the family to die. Her death occurred sometime around the 12th or 13th year of her father's reign. The death scene is depicted in one of the rock-cut chambers of the royal tomb at Amarna. Her parents are shown, standing beside her bier, their faces racked with grief. The image is one of the most direct representations of mortal sorrow in all of Egyptian art. The body of Meketaten, like the body of every other member of the royal family, has not been recovered. Her tomb chamber was emptied in antiquity, presumably during the systematic dismantling of the city after the dynasty's fall. What happened to her remains is not known. Onkesenpaten, the third daughter, would have the longest and the most dramatic afterlife of any of the children of Nefertiti. She was eventually married to her half-brother Tutankhaten, the boy who would change his name to Tutankhamun and rule as pharaoh after the collapse of the Amarna experiment. Their marriage, conducted in the political chaos of the early Restoration, was childless. There is some evidence that the queen, after her husband's premature death, sent a famous letter to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I, requesting that he send one of his own sons to Egypt to marry her. The letter, preserved in fragmentary form in the Hittite royal archives at Hattusa, is one of the most extraordinary documents of ancient diplomacy. The queen, identified in the Hittite records by the title Dahamunzu, writes that her husband has died, that she has no sons, and that she is unwilling to marry one of her own subjects. She requests a Hittite prince. The Hittite king, after consulting with his advisors, eventually sent his son, Zenanza. Zenanza was murdered on his way to Egypt. The Hittite king blamed the Egyptians for the murder and launched a punitive campaign against the Egyptian border possessions in Syria. The Egyptian succession passed instead to the elderly Ai. The fate of Onkesenpaten, who had probably written the original letter under the regnal name Onkesenamun by that point, is not known. She is not heard of after the accession of Ai. She may have been killed. She may have died of natural causes. She may have been quietly removed from the court. Her body, like her mother's, has not been identified. The 4th, 5th, and 6th daughters disappear from the record at various points in the late years of Akhenaten's reign. Neferneferuaten Tasheret, the 4th, is last attested in inscriptions from approximately the same period as the death of Meketaten. Neferneferuer, the 5th, may have died slightly earlier. Setepenre, the 6th and youngest, born late in the reign, vanishes from the record at the same time. The economical explanation is that all 3 died in the same wave of disease that killed Meketaten. They were buried presumably in the royal tomb at Amarna, in the chambers that have since been emptied. Their bodies have not been recovered. The diplomatic correspondence of the period, written on baked clay tablets in the Akkadian language, was archived in a building near the center of the city that has come to be known as the Place of the Letters of Pharaoh. The archive was discovered in the late 1880s, when local villagers stumbled upon the buried tablets while digging for fertilizer in the ruins of the abandoned city. The tablets were scattered. Some were sold to dealers. some were destroyed. The surviving fragments, which now number in the hundreds, are held in collections in London, Berlin, Cairo, Paris, and elsewhere. They include letters sent to the Egyptian court by the king of Babylon, the king of Mitanni, the king of the Hittites, the king of Assyria, the king of Cyprus, the king of Arzawa, and the kings of dozens of vassal states in Canaan and Syria. The letters from the great kings are formal and conventional in their phrasing, but revealing in their content. The king of Babylon, in one letter, complains that the Egyptian gold that arrived in his recent shipment was of poor quality. When he had it melted down, the king writes, the actual quantity of gold recovered was less than what had been promised. He requests that the next shipment be of better metal. He also requests, in passing, a particular type of carved ivory that he has heard the Egyptian craftsmen produce particularly well. He sends, with his letter, a return gift of horses, of furniture, and of women for the harem of the Egyptian king. The letter is signed with the Babylonian king's seal and dispatched through the standard diplomatic channels. The king of Mitanni, in a different letter, writes to congratulate Akhenaten on his accession and to remind him of the long-standing friendship between their two royal houses. The king of Mitanni's daughter, Tadukipa, had been sent to Egypt some years earlier as a bride for Akhenaten's father, Amenhotep III, and had presumably been transferred to Akhenaten's own household after the old king's death. The Mitanni king inquires after his daughter's welfare. He asks that she be treated with the honor due to her royal birth. He sends his regards. The letter is one of the few surviving documents that refers, even obliquely, to the foreign princesses who had been incorporated into the Egyptian royal household and whose fates within the harem are otherwise almost entirely undocumented. The letters from the vassal kings of Canaan and Syria are radically different in tone. They are urgent, panicked, sometimes hysterical. The vassal kings write that their territories are being invaded by the Apiru, a vaguely defined group of marauders, bandits, or rebellious populations, depending on the context. They write that neighboring vassal kings have rebelled and joined the Apiru and are now attacking loyal cities. They write that the troops promised by the Egyptian king have not arrived. They write that the messengers they have sent have not returned. They write that the gold and the equipment they have requested have not been delivered. They beg for help. They invoke the long history of Egyptian dominion. They remind the king of the oaths sworn at the time of their original submission. They write that if help does not arrive, their cities will fall. One particularly poignant series of letters comes from a vassal king named Ribhada of Byblos. Ribhada was the ruler of one of the most strategically important Egyptian client cities on the Syrian coast. Byblos was the principal port through which cedar wood from the Lebanon mountains was exported to Egypt, and the loss of Byblos would have meant the loss of the most important source of building timber in the eastern Mediterranean. Ribhada wrote to Akhenaten dozens of times. The letters span several years. They begin with formal requests for assistance. They progress through increasingly desperate pleas. They end with what reads almost as a personal collapse. Ribhada writes that he is old. He writes that he is ill. He writes that he has no children, no allies, no resources. He writes that the city is starving. He writes that he has been forced to sell his own household furniture to buy grain. He writes that if the Egyptian king does not send help, he will have to flee to the neighboring city of Sumer, where he hopes he will be received as a guest. He writes that he is the king's faithful servant. He writes that he has always been the king's faithful servant. He asks, again and again, that troops be sent. The replies from the Egyptian court, in those few cases where replies have survived, are formal and non-committal. The king instructs Ribhada to be vigilant. The king assures Ribhada of his ongoing concern. The king sends, with his letter, a small gift of grain or of cloth. The king does not send troops. Ribhada's city eventually fell. The Apiru and the rebellious neighboring vassals overran Byblos. Ribhada himself disappeared from the historical record. He may have been killed in the fall of the city. He may have fled to Sumer. He may have died of illness. The Egyptian empire in northern Syria collapsed over the course of the decade. By the time the dynasty fell, the territorial extent of Egyptian rule in the Levant had been substantially reduced. The pharaohs of the 19th dynasty would spend much of their reigns trying to recover what had been lost. The picture that emerges from the Amarna letters is of a court that had grown insular, distracted, and inattentive to the practical demands of empire. The king at the center of the picture is the king who had abolished the worship of the chief god of his state, who had built a new capital in the desert, who had elevated his queen to a co-equal position, who had sworn an oath never to leave the city of Akhetaten, and who was, at the time he was receiving these increasingly desperate letters from his vassals, more interested in the theology of the disk than in the defense of his foreign possessions. Whether this characterization is fair is a matter of scholarly debate. What is not in doubt is that the empire was contracting, that the vassal kings were losing confidence in their overlord, and that the foundations of the dynasty's external power were being eroded year by year while the king focused on his religious program at home. Inside the city, however, the experiment continued at its full pitch. The temples operated daily. The artisans produced their work in the workshops. The royal family appeared at the prescribed ceremonies. The walls of the new palaces filled with paintings of birds and reeds and waterfowl. The hymns were sung, the offerings were made. The boundary stelae stood at the edges of the territory, their oaths still binding. The city had its own internal momentum. It was not aware of the slow loss of foreign possessions, or if it was aware, it did not concern itself. It was looking inward, at its own newly invented rituals, at its own new theology, at the daily relationship between the royal couple and the disk of the sun above them. That, in the years when the city was at its peak, was the entire focus of attention. It did not last. The trouble began, as far as can be reconstructed, with a wave of disease. Sometime in the latter part of the 14th century before the Common Era, an epidemic moved through the eastern Mediterranean. The exact nature of the illness is unknown. It may have been a form of plague. It may have been a respiratory infection. It may have been something else entirely. What is known is that it killed large numbers of people in the Hittite Empire to the north, in Cyprus, in coastal Syria, in Canaan, and, eventually, in Egypt. The Amarna letters, the diplomatic correspondence preserved on clay tablets in the archives of the new capital, contain references to the disease in passing. A foreign king writes to complain that he cannot send a delegation because his court is sick. A vassal writes to apologize for a delay in tribute because his messengers have died. The references are oblique, but they are persistent. In the royal household at Amarna, the disease arrived sometime around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign. The exact sequence of events is unclear. What is clear is that within a relatively short period, possibly within a single year, possibly across 2 or 3 years, the family at the center of the new capital began to die. The first death, as far as can be reconstructed from the evidence, was that of the second daughter, Meketaten. She was very young, possibly only 9 or 10 years old, possibly slightly older. She was depicted in the royal tomb at Amarna, which had been prepared in the cliffs east of the city, laid out on a bier in a chamber that had been carved for her specifically. Her parents were shown standing beside her body in attitudes of intense grief. The image is unusual in Egyptian art, which generally avoided the explicit depiction of mortal sorrow. The king and the queen are shown not as remote divine figures, but as a father and a mother weeping over the body of a child. The image is so direct, so unmediated, that it cannot be looked at without flinching. Whoever carved it knew exactly what the parents felt, because the parents were standing there while the carving was done. Around the same time, possibly slightly later, the youngest princesses also disappeared from the record. 3 of the 6 daughters of Nefertiti vanish from inscriptions in the closing years of Akhenaten's reign. They are not mentioned in any subsequent text. There are no records of their funerals, no images of their burials, no further appearances at court. They simply stop appearing. The most economical explanation is that they died, possibly in the same epidemic that killed Meketaten. Queen Tiye, the king's mother, also died around this time. She had outlived her husband Amenhotep III by more than a decade and had spent her widowhood largely at Amarna with her son and his family. Her burial equipment, fragments of which have survived, was prepared in the new capital. Her body was eventually moved, after the abandonment of the city, to the older royal necropolis at Thebes, where some of her possessions have been found in the burial known as Tomb 55, alongside other royal equipment of disputed identification. Her death removed one of the last living connections between the new dynasty and the older world of Egyptian tradition. And somewhere in this same period, somewhere in the storm of deaths that swept through the royal household of Amarna in the closing years of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti also vanished. She did not die in any way that has been documented. There is no tomb identified as hers at Amarna. There is no burial equipment surviving in her name. There is no image of her funeral, no inscription recording her death, no statement from any source naming the date or the manner of her passing. She simply, like the daughters, like the priests of Amun, like the names of the older gods, ceases to appear in the inscriptions. The last unambiguous reference to her, as the Queen of Akhenaten, dates from the 12th year of his reign, when she was depicted alongside him and the surviving daughters at a great durbar, a public ceremony at which the king received tribute from foreign delegations. After that ceremony, the queen disappears. For a long time, this disappearance was interpreted as simple death. The plague had swept through the household. The queen had been carried off along with her daughters. Her burial, the assumption went, had been arranged but had subsequently been lost or destroyed in the systematic dismantling of the Amarna period that took place after her husband's death. This was the standard scholarly explanation for most of the 20th century. It was tidy, it was economical, it required no particularly strange assumptions. It also turned out to be wrong. The first cracks in the simple death theory appeared in the 1970s, when scholars began to take a fresh look at a curious figure who had appeared in the inscriptions in the last years of Akhenaten's reign. This figure was named Nefertiti. The name was the same one that Nefertiti had taken when the royal family converted to the Aten cult, the one that had been prefixed to her own name when she became Nefertiti. The figure, called simply Neferuaten, was a pharaoh. The figure had a full royal titulary. The figure had cartouches, the oval rings that enclosed only the names of kings. The figure ruled, briefly, in the period between Akhenaten's death and the accession of the boy who would become Tutankhamun. The figure's gender was indicated, in some inscriptions, by feminine grammatical endings attached to royal titles that would normally be masculine. The figure was, in other words, a female pharaoh ruling in her own right, using the same name that Nefertiti had used as queen. The implications were enormous. If the pharaoh Neferuaten was the same person as Queen Nefertiti, then she had not died at the end of her husband's reign. She had survived him. She had taken the throne. She had ruled Egypt as king, not as queen, for a brief period before the throne passed to the boy Tutankhamun. And if she had ruled, then she had presumably also been buried in the manner of a pharaoh, not in the manner of a queen, which meant that she should have a royal tomb somewhere, and that tomb should still exist, somewhere, waiting to be found. The evidence for Neferuaten as a distinct ruler comes from a small number of texts, but those texts are specific and concrete. The most important of them is a graffito scratched into the plaster of a Theban tomb at Sheikh Abd el-Qurna, the burial chamber of an official named Peri, known by its modern catalog number as Theban Tomb 139. The graffito was inscribed during the third regnal year of a pharaoh whose throne name is given as Ankh-Heperur, beloved of Wanre. Wanre, meaning Soul One of Re, was one of Akhenaten's regnal epithets. The graffito's date formula, year 3, third month of the inundation season, day 10, places its composition some years after Akhenaten's death, possibly 2 or 3 years afterward, depending on the regnal year count used. The graffito was written by a priest named Pawa, who held office in the temple of Amun at Karnak. The text of the graffito is a prayer. The priest Pawa, writing in his own voice, addresses the god Amun. He thanks the god for his continuing favor. He asks for the god's continued protection. He records his own pious activities on behalf of the temple. The remarkable feature of the prayer is its setting. It is being addressed to Amun, the chief god of Thebes, the very deity whose worship had been suppressed during the Amarna heresy, in the third year of a pharaoh, whose throne name still incorporates a praise formula for Akhenaten. The priest Pawa is, in other words, worshipping the old chief god in the official regnal context of a pharaoh who continues to honor the dead heretic king. The Amarna theology has not been formally renounced. The Amun temple has, however, evidently reopened. or at least is conducting religious activities sufficient for a priest to scratch a prayer celebrating the god's favor onto a tomb wall, and to date that prayer to the reign of the current pharaoh. The transition is in progress. The pharaoh, in whose name the graffito is dated, is presiding over the beginning of the restoration while still maintaining nominal honor to the dead architect of the heresy. This is the position that Nefertiti, if she became the pharaoh Nefer-Nefer-Rotten, would have occupied. She was the widow of Akhenaten. She had stood at his side for most of his reign. She could not have publicly renounced him, but she could, by quietly tolerating the reopening of the old temples, begin to undo what had been done. Several other inscriptions and small finds carry the throne name Ankh-Khepurur with feminine grammatical endings. These have been collected and catalogued by various scholars over the decades. The cumulative evidence is small in absolute terms, but is persistent. It includes seal impressions found at Amarna and at other 18th dynasty sites, a small ivory plaque on which the cartouches of Ankh-Khepurur are recorded as a ruler separate from Akhenaten, fragments of stone inscriptions recovered from various locations, and a number of ostraca and papyrus documents that mention the pharaoh in administrative contexts. The cumulative picture is of a ruler who reigned for a small number of years, who used a throne name closely associated with the Amarna theology and with Akhenaten's praise epithets, and whose gender was, on several occasions, indicated by feminine grammatical markers attached to royal titles. The candidates for the identity of this ruler have been argued at length. The principal candidates are Nefertiti herself, the eldest daughter Meritaten, and a hypothetical otherwise unknown sister or aunt who has not been independently attested. A second piece of evidence is a fragmentary stela, now in the Egyptian Museum in Berlin, where it carries the catalog number AM 17813 and is commonly known as the Pace Stela, after its ancient owner. The stela was originally carved during the Amarna period and depicts two royal figures seated side by side beneath the rays of the Aten. The figures are of equal scale. The cartouches that should have identified them are empty. They were prepared as blanks, in the expectation that the names of the rulers would be added later, but for reasons that are not known, the names were never inscribed. The stela has come to be known, in the modern scholarly literature, as the co-regency stela, on the assumption that the two equal-scale figures must represent two co-ruling pharaohs. The identity of the second pharaoh has been argued. Some scholars have suggested that the second figure is Smenkhkare, the otherwise obscure ruler whose brief reign followed Akhenaten's death. Other scholars, including the French Egyptologist Marc Gabold, have argued that the second figure is Nefertiti, elevated to the status of co-regent during the last years of her husband's reign, and thereby providing the institutional foundation for her subsequent rule as the pharaoh Nefer-Nefer-Rutin. The co-regency stela cannot, by itself, prove either interpretation. The empty cartouches do not name the second figure. The relative scale of the two seated rulers is suggestive, but is not, in itself, decisive. What the stela does establish is that someone in the last years of Akhenaten's reign was prepared to commission a monument depicting two pharaohs of equal status seated together beneath the disk of the sun, and that this person was sufficiently uncertain about who the second pharaoh would ultimately turn out to be that the cartouches were left blank. The institutional possibility of a co-regency had been created. The names had not yet been settled. This is the kind of moment that historians of dynastic politics learn to recognize. It is the moment at which the succession is being negotiated. It is the moment at which various candidates are being weighed against each other. It is the moment in which a queen who has held an unusually elevated position throughout her husband's reign might plausibly be considered as his successor, and in which the formal mechanism of co-regency might plausibly be used to transition her from the status of queen to the status of king-in-waiting. A third document often discussed in connection with the question of Nefertiti's continued life after the 12th year of her husband's reign is the so-called Amarna co-regency stela, a separate fragmentary inscription that was recovered during the excavations of the early 20th century at the abandoned capital itself. The inscription is damaged. The most controversial reading, advanced by certain scholars, is that the stela refers to Nefertiti by name in a context that implies she was holding a royal title at the time of its composition. The reading is not universally accepted. The damage to the inscription makes confident interpretation difficult. But the possibility that the stela documents her elevation has been one of the recurring arguments in the case for her survival into the post-Amarna transition. Taken together, the Paua graffito at Sheikh Abd el-Qurna, the Couragency stela in Berlin, the fragmentary Amarna inscriptions referring to Couragency, the small number of objects bearing the throne name Ankh Keperur with feminine grammatical markers, and the broader pattern of inscriptions in which Nefertiti is shown performing pharaonic functions during her husband's reign, constitute the evidentiary basis for the modern hypothesis that she survived Akhenaten and ruled briefly in her own right. The evidence is not conclusive. It is, however, sufficient to have moved the scholarly consensus over the last 50 years away from the older simple death interpretation and toward an acknowledgement that some other reconstruction must be considered. The older confidence has been broken. The question is now genuinely open. It will remain open until either her tomb is found, with her own undisturbed burial equipment naming her as either queen or pharaoh, or until some new inscriptional evidence emerges that settles the question definitively. The identification of Nefertiti with the pharaoh Nefer-Neferuaten has been argued and re-argued for the last 50 years. The case for it is not airtight. There are alternative candidates, most notably the eldest daughter Meritaten, who might also fit the available evidence. There is a competing theory that holds that Nefer-Neferuaten was actually a co-regent who ruled jointly with her father in the final years of his reign, rather than independently after his death. There is a third theory that holds that the pharaoh Nefer-Neferuaten and a separately attested pharaoh named Smenkhkare were the same person, possibly an otherwise unknown brother of Akhenaten. The scholarly literature on this question is dense, technical, and largely inconclusive. What is reasonably well established is that someone with feminine grammatical markers held the throne of Egypt for a brief period in the late 1330s before the Common Era, and that this person used a name closely associated with the Queen Nefertiti. Beyond that, almost everything is in dispute. What is certain is that within a few years of Akhenaten's death, the great experiment at Amarna was over. The royal court left the new capital. The boy who had been born Tutankhaten, the son of Akhenaten by a minor wife or possibly by an unidentified sister, changed his name to Tutankhamen, returning the element of the chief god Amen to the royal name. The court moved back to Thebes. The temples of the old gods were reopened. The priesthoods that had been displaced were restored. The artisans who had been working in the radical new style were redirected to producing more conventional images. The whole vast experiment of Amarna was, within a single generation, in the process of being dismantled. The dismantling did not happen all at once. It happened in waves. Before the waves of formal erasure began, there was a brief period of transition during which the central question of the succession was being worked out. Akhenaten died, by the most likely reconstruction, in the 17th year of his reign, which would correspond to approximately 1336 before the Common Era. The cause of his death is not known. He may have died of the same plague that had swept through his family in the closing years. He may have died of some unrelated illness or injury. His body, if the identification of the Tomb 55 mummy is accepted, shows no obvious signs of violence and is consistent with a death from natural causes at approximately the right age. The mummy is severely damaged, however, and any conclusions about cause of death are necessarily provisional. The immediate succession went, according to most reconstructions, to a brief reign by the figure known as Smenkhkare, who held the throne for a period variously estimated at between 1 and 3 years. Smenkkare's identity is one of the most disputed questions of the period. He may have been a son of Akhenaten by a minor wife, possibly Kia. He may have been a brother or a half-brother of Akhenaten. He may, in one of the more controversial recent theories, have been Nefertiti herself, ruling under a male regnal name as part of her elevation to pharaonic status. If Smenkhkare and Nefertiti were the same person, then the apparent marriage to Meritaten cannot be taken at face value, and scholars who advance the identification have argued that the marriage was a ceremonial or political construction rather than a literal one, possibly intended to consolidate the dynastic claim in the chaotic transitional period. The arguments in each direction are technical. The available evidence does not permit a confident decision. What is reasonably clear is that during this brief transitional period, the religious revolution did not immediately collapse. The court continued to reside, for at least some of the time, at Amarna. The temples of the Aten continued to operate. The artisans continued to produce work in the Amarna style. The boundary stelae still stood at the edges of the territory, and no formal renunciation of the oaths sworn by Akhenaten had been made. The new theology had its own institutional momentum, and that momentum carried it forward for some additional time after the death of its principal architect. The collapse began with the accession of the boy king Tutankhaten, who would within a few years change his name to Tutankhamun and abandon the city. Tutankhaten was approximately 9 years old at the time of his accession. He could not have been making policy himself. The decisions of his reign were being made by his advisors. The most prominent of these advisors was Ai, the elderly god's father, who was almost certainly Nefertiti's father, if the standard genealogy is correct, and who had been one of the senior officials of the court throughout the Amarna period. Ai was, by this point, an old man. He had served Akhenaten through the heretical years. He was, by the available evidence, a survivor, a man who had adapted to one religious revolution and was now prepared to adapt to a counter-revolution. His exact role in the transition is not entirely clear, but he appears to have been the principal architect of the boy king's policy. The other prominent figure of the new regime was the general Horemheb, who commanded the Egyptian army. Horemheb's background is obscure. He was not, by his own admission, of royal blood. He had risen through the military hierarchy during the reigns of Akhenaten and his immediate successors. He had been, at various points, the king's chief deputy, the supreme commander of the armed forces, and the representative of the king in matters of foreign affairs. He had served at Amarna. He had presumably worshipped the Aten as the official religion required, but his loyalty to the new theology, judging by his subsequent actions, had been entirely pragmatic. He was, in the new arrangement, prepared to dismantle everything he had spent the previous 20 years upholding. The court moved in the first few years of Tutankhamun's reign from Amarna back to the older religious centers. The principal royal residence was re-established at Memphis, in the north of Egypt, near the apex of the Nile Delta. The religious capital was re-established at Thebes, in the south, where the temple of Amun at Karnak was reopened, and where the displaced priesthood of the chief god was restored to its accustomed honors and revenues. The boy king visited Karnak. He participated in the rituals. He was depicted, in the surviving reliefs of his reign, performing the traditional ceremonies of the older religion. The change of his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun was the most visible single act of the restoration. The element of the Aten was removed. The element of Amun, the chief god of the older state religion, was reinstated. The royal name announced, to anyone who could read it, that the new king had aligned himself with the old gods. The Restoration Stela, issued in approximately the 3rd or 4th year of Tutankhamun's reign, was the most important official document of the early restoration. It was a tall granite slab, inscribed on both sides with a long text describing the condition of the temples at the beginning of the king's reign and the work that was being done to restore them. The text described the temples as having fallen into ruin, with their sanctuaries overgrown with weeds, their priests scattered, their offerings unmade, their gods absent. It described the consequences. The gods had withdrawn their favor from Egypt. Armies sent abroad had failed. Plagues had swept through the cities. The land had suffered. The king was now, the text declared, restoring the temples, recalling the priests, reestablishing the offerings, repairing the damage. The gods would return. The favor of heaven would be restored. The order of the world would be repaired. The Restoration Stela did not name Akhenaten. It did not name the Aten. It did not refer to the city of Amarna or to the religious revolution that had displaced the older gods. It described the period of disorder in entirely general terms, as if the cause of the disorder were a vague and impersonal misfortune rather than the specific policy of the previous king. This was diplomatic silence. The boy king and his advisors had not yet committed themselves to the open denunciation of the previous reign. They were dismantling the new theology, but they were doing so quietly, without drawing public attention to the fact that the previous king had been responsible for the conditions they were now repairing. The strategy was cautious. It was probably designed to avoid stirring up resistance from those members of the elite who had been beneficiaries of the Amarna regime and whose continued cooperation was needed for the restoration to proceed. Throughout the early restoration, the city of Amarna itself was not yet officially abandoned. The royal court had moved away, the principal religious institutions had relocated, but the city continued to exist. Some of its workshops continued to operate, some of its residents continued to live in their houses. The boundary stelae still stood at the edges of the territory, their oaths still legally binding even if no longer politically operative. The transition was gradual rather than sudden. The city was being slowly emptied rather than dramatically demolished. The full demolition would come later, under the next generation. Tutankhamun died, suddenly, at approximately the age of 19. The cause of his death has been the subject of extensive modern medical investigation, including detailed CT scans of his mummy and the DNA analysis already mentioned. The current consensus, based on the imaging evidence, is that he suffered from a number of underlying medical conditions, including possibly a club foot and the after effects of malaria, and that his immediate cause of death was probably a complication following an injury, possibly a fracture of the leg that became infected. The infection, in a young man already in poor health and possibly suffering from the genetic consequences of generations of brother-sister marriage in the royal house, would have been sufficient to cause death within a few days or weeks. The various older theories of murder, while persistent in popular accounts, are not supported by the modern medical evidence. His death created an immediate succession crisis. He had no surviving children. His widow, Ankhesenamun, the third daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, was the last surviving member of the direct royal line of the Amarna family. The succession would normally have passed through her marriage to a new king. The new king, in the conventional Egyptian arrangement, would have been a senior official or general who married the royal heiress and thereby inherited her claim to the throne. The available candidates included A and Horemheb, both of whom were already powerful figures in the regency that had governed during Tutankhamun's minority. It was at this point that the famous letter to the Hittite king, mentioned earlier, was reportedly written. The queen, identified in the Hittite records as Da-Munzu, which appears to be a rendering of the Egyptian title meaning the king's wife, wrote that her husband had died and that she had no son. She wrote that she was unwilling to take one of her own subjects as her husband. She requested that the Hittite king send one of his sons to Egypt to marry her and become king. The request was extraordinary. No previous Egyptian queen had ever proposed to import a foreign prince as her husband. The Hittite king, after some hesitation and the dispatch of his own diplomatic mission to confirm their request, eventually agreed and sent his son Zenanza to Egypt. Zenanza was killed before he arrived. The accusations regarding his death have been argued for decades. The Hittite court blamed the Egyptians and launched a punitive military campaign in revenge. The Egyptian throne passed instead to Ai, who presumably married Ankhesenamun in order to legitimize his accession. Ankhesenamun then disappears from the record. Her fate is unknown. Ai's reign lasted approximately 4 years. He was, by the time of his accession, an extremely old man. He had served at the court of Akhenaten, then at the court of Tutankhamun, and was now ruling Egypt in his own right, at an age that must have been close to 70. His reign was brief, undistinguished, and is poorly documented. He continued the policies of the early restoration. He did not pursue any aggressive new program of either religious or political reform. He died, apparently of natural causes, after a reign of approximately 4 years. The succession then passed to Horemheb, the general who had been waiting his turn. Horemheb's accession was the effective end of the 18th dynasty. He had no blood claim to the throne. He was not, as far as can be determined, related to the royal house by either descent or marriage, although there is some suggestion that he may have eventually married one of the surviving royal women, possibly Mutnajmet, who is variously identified as a sister of Nefertiti or as a different royal princess. Horemheb's accession was based on his control of the army and the administrative apparatus. The dynasty had failed to produce a viable male heir. The court was prepared to accept a successful general as the new king. Horemheb took the throne and began the second wave of dismantling. The first wave was quiet. The boy king, Tutankhamun, advised by senior officials who had survived the Amarna period and adapted to the new political reality, made no public denunciation of his father. He simply, gradually, restored the old gods. He issued a great stela, the so-called Restoration Stela, which described in some detail the damage that had been done to the temples during the previous reign and the work that was now being done to repair them. The stela did not name Akhenaten. It referred to the previous reign obliquely, as a period when the gods had turned their backs on Egypt and had withdrawn their favor. It implied criticism without making the criticism explicit. The boy king was being careful. He was probably no more than 9 or 10 years old when he began this work. The decisions were being made by his advisors, principally a senior official named Ai, who held the title of God's father, and a general named Horemheb, who commanded the army. Both men had served at the court of Akhenaten. Both men knew exactly how the new regime had functioned. Both men were now in the process of taking it apart. The second wave came a few years later, after Tutankhamun's premature death at around the age of 19. The boy king died suddenly, possibly from injury, possibly from disease, possibly from some combination of both. He had no surviving children. The succession passed, briefly, to the elderly Ai, who ruled for only a few years before himself dying. The succession then passed to the general Horemheb, who had no royal blood at all, but who had the army and the administrative apparatus behind him. Horemheb's accession marked the effective end of the 18th dynasty. He was followed by an entirely new line, the 19th dynasty, founded by his vizier and successor Ramesses I. Under Horemheb and his successors, the slow dismantling that had begun under Tutankhamun became a systematic erasure. Horemheb's agents went into the Amarna boundary territory and began the work of tearing down the new capital. The temples of the Aten were demolished, stone by stone. The blocks were carted away to be used as fill-in other construction projects, particularly in the great temple complex at Karnak that was being expanded by the new dynasty. Thousands of these reused blocks, known to modern scholars as talatat, have been recovered from later construction at Karnak and elsewhere. They form one of the most important surviving sources for the art and the inscriptions of the Amarna period, precisely because the people who tried to destroy them did not destroy them thoroughly enough. They broke them up. They reused them. They buried them inside other walls. They did not understand, or did not care, that they were preserving the evidence even as they thought they were removing it. The names of Akhenaten and Nefertiti began, at this point, to be chiseled out of the surviving monuments. The work was done by hand. The chisels were made of bronze. The workers climbed ladders. They scraped at the carved faces and the carved names. They left the surrounding text intact, in most cases, but they took out the specific identifying marks. The result, on many of the surviving talatat blocks, is a recognizable scene with the principal figures hollowed out, as if the queen had been there, and then had been physically subtracted from the stone. The official king lists, which the priests of Amun maintained at Karnak and elsewhere as the canonical record of the rulers of Egypt, simply omitted Akhenaten and his immediate successors. The list jumped from Amenhotep III directly to Horemheb, as if the entire Amarna period had not happened. Nefertiti was not omitted from the king lists, because she had never been in them. Queens were not included in the standard king lists, but if she had ever held the throne as the pharaoh Neferneferuaten, that brief reign was also erased. The official memory of Egypt, as preserved in the lists of pharaohs maintained by the priesthoods, contained no record that the city of Amarna had ever been built, that the cult of the Aten had ever been practiced, or that a queen named Nefertiti had ever stood beside her husband at the height of the religious revolution. The most thoroughgoing of these erasures was the work of Horemheb himself. The general who had become pharaoh was the man with the strongest personal interest in the elimination of his predecessor's memory. He had served the Amarna court. He had risen through the ranks during the years when the heresy was at its peak. He had taken oaths of loyalty to Akhenaten, presumably more than once, and had performed the rituals of the Aten cult in his capacity as a senior officer of the heretical state. He had then served the restoration regime under Tutankhamun and Ai, during which time he had presumably participated in the early stages of the dismantling. By the time he himself took the throne, he had personally lived through every phase of the Amarna experiment and its aftermath, and his political identity depended on his ability to present himself as the legitimate continuation of the older dynastic tradition, rather than as the latest in a sequence of compromised survivors. His solution? was a comprehensive program of usurpation, applied not only to the heretical pharaohs but also to the immediate predecessors who had ruled during the Restoration. The monuments of Tutankhamun, which the boy king had erected as part of the early restoration effort, were systematically recarved by Horemheb's agents to substitute his own cartouches for those of the boy. The Restoration Stela, the principal public document of Tutankhamun's reign, was rewritten with Horemheb's name in place of Tutankhamun's. The temples that Tutankhamun had reopened were rededicated under Horemheb's name. The statues that Tutankhamun had commissioned were rebadged. The boy king, whose actual contribution to the restoration had been modest because of his youth, was nonetheless the legitimate heir of the Amarna royal line, and his memory presented Horemheb with a problem. The simplest solution was to take his monuments and claim them as Horemheb's own. The same treatment was applied to the monuments of Ai, the elderly god's father who had ruled briefly between Tutankhamun and Horemheb. Ai's funerary temple was usurped. Ai's tomb in the Valley of the Kings was entered and desecrated, with the names of Ai chiseled out of the painted walls and the cartouches replaced, in some cases, with those of Horemheb himself. The systematic nature of the erasure suggests that Horemheb saw Ai not merely as a predecessor whose memory could be quietly demoted, but as an active political threat whose continued public veneration would have undermined Horemheb's own claim to legitimacy. Ai's connection to Nefertiti as her probable father and as the senior figure of the Amarna court who had successfully transitioned to the Restoration made him particularly dangerous to Horemheb's revisionist program. The link between Ai and the heretical regime was too direct to be ignored. The link had to be cut. The most striking single example of Horemheb's revisionist program is his own dated inscriptions. The general, by the time he died, had ruled Egypt for approximately 27 or 28 years, depending on the chronological reconstruction used. His final dated inscriptions, however, give regnal years substantially in excess of his actual reign. The highest attested year of Horemheb is year 59, recorded on a private document that has been interpreted as a tax, assessment, or legal record. A reign of 59 years is not consistent with the known biographical data on Horemheb, who was already a senior figure during the reign of Akhenaten, and who could not, by simple arithmetic, have lived long enough to rule for 59 years on top of his earlier career. The most economical explanation, accepted by most scholars, is that Horemheb's regnal year count was retroactively extended to incorporate the reigns of his predecessors. He counted, as part of his own reign, the years of Akhenaten, of Smenkhare, of Neferneferuaten, of Tutankhamun, and of Ai. The Amarna pharaohs were not merely written out of the king lists. They were absorbed, in the official chronology, into the reign of the man who had come after them. The heresy had not happened. The boy king had not happened. The brief reign of the female pharaoh had not happened. There had been, in the official chronology that Horemheb constructed for the benefit of later record keepers, only the long and legitimate reign of Horemheb, stretching back from his actual accession to the end of the reign of Amenhotep III, with nothing in between. The legal apparatus of Horemheb's reign reinforced this revisionist program. The most important of his surviving legal texts is the document known as the Edict of Horemheb, inscribed on a great stela that was erected at Karnak and that has been preserved in fragmentary condition. The edict is a comprehensive legal code addressing a wide range of administrative abuses. It describes the misconduct of various officials during what the text calls a previous period of disorder, and it prescribes severe penalties for officials who continue such abuses under the new regime. The text does not name the previous period explicitly, but the context is unmistakable. The disorder it describes is the disorder of the Amarna years and their aftermath. The corruption it condemns is the corruption that had flourished during the religious experiment and its collapse. The new regime is presented, in the edict, as a return to legitimate order after a period during which legitimate order had been lost. The edict mentions, in passing, the demolition of certain religious establishments and the redirection of their resources to the proper service of the gods. It does not specify which establishments. It does not name the heretical pharaohs by name, but the implication is clear. The temples of the Aten are being demolished. Their endowments are being transferred to the older gods. The administrative apparatus that had supported the heresy is being dismantled. The legal authority for these actions, the edict establishes, is the authority of Horemheb himself, acting as the legitimate restorer of the proper order of Egyptian government. Horemheb's own tomb tells a particular story about his program of erasure. He had begun construction of a private tomb at Saqqara, near the ancient capital of Memphis, during the years when he was still a senior official under Tutankhamun. The Saqqara tomb is large and elaborately decorated. Its reliefs show Horemheb in his capacity as commander of the army, receiving foreign prisoners, supervising military campaigns, and conducting the affairs of state on behalf of the boy king. The reliefs were carved in a transitional style, retaining some elements of the Amarna manner while moving toward the older formal conventions. They are an important source for the art and the political iconography of the immediate post-Amarna period. When Horemheb became pharaoh, however, he abandoned the Saqqara tomb. A king of Egypt could not be buried in a private tomb of the type appropriate to a senior official. He needed a royal burial in the Valley of the Kings. He began construction of a new tomb, designated Tomb 57, in the valley itself. The Saqqara tomb was left, partially completed, with its reliefs still in place. Its decorated reliefs had been entering European museum collections through dealers since the early 19th century, ending up in Leiden, Bologna, Berlin, and Cairo. But the tomb itself was not relocated by archaeologists until Geoffrey Martin's expedition reached it in 1975. The painted reliefs from the Saqqara tomb provide some of the clearest images of Horemheb's public face during the years when he was building his political base for the eventual move to the throne. His royal tomb at the Valley of the Kings, Tomb 57, is one of the more elaborate burials in the valley. The painted decoration is of high quality. The scenes depict the king's progress through the underworld in the manner of the standard New Kingdom royal funerary tradition. There is no trace of the Amarna style. There is no reference to the Aten. The theological framework is the older Osirian and solar tradition that Horemheb's regime was working to restore. The tomb itself is a complete renunciation of the Amarna experiment. The king who lies in it is the king who has erased that experiment from the official record. His afterlife will be conducted in the manner of the old gods, with no acknowledgement that the new gods had ever existed. The body of Horemheb himself was not, as it turned out, left in his royal tomb. Tomb 57 was robbed in antiquity, and Horemheb's mummy was removed at some point during the disturbed conditions of the late New Kingdom. It has not been positively identified among the relocated royal mummies in the various caches. He may be one of the unlabeled bodies in the Deir el-Bahri cache or in the Tomb 35 cache. He may have been destroyed entirely by tomb robbers. The man who had labored to erase the bodies of his predecessors from history had himself, by the standard accidents of time and theft, been similarly erased. The chisels that he had ordered to be put to work on the names of Nefertiti and Akhenaten and I had eventually, in their own slow, indifferent way, been turned against him. The third wave came 2 centuries later, under the long reign of Ramesses II. By that time, the Amarna period was a historical memory, distant enough to be safely referenced, close enough to still be politically sensitive. Ramesses II, who reigned for 66 years and who plastered his name across every monument he could find, took credit in his own inscriptions for the demolition of the temples of the heretic king. He did not actually do the demolition himself. Most of it had been completed before he was born, but he claimed it. He had his scribes record the work as if it had been done under his orders. He used the dismantling of Amarna as part of his own propaganda program, casting himself as the restorer of the old gods and the destroyer of the wicked heresy that had preceded his dynasty. The man who had actually done most of the work, Horemheb, was largely written out of the story. The man who took credit, Ramesses II, became in later memory the great restorer of Egyptian religion, although his actual contribution was modest. By the end of the 19th dynasty, the erasure was essentially complete. The city of Amarna had been abandoned and stripped. The temples of the Aten had been demolished. The royal family of the heretical period had been written out of the king lists. The artistic style of Amarna had been forgotten, displaced by a return to the older formal conventions. The name of Nefertiti had been chiseled out of most of the monuments where it had appeared. The boundary stelae at the edges of the abandoned city still stood, but they were too remote and too embedded in the cliffs to be worth the effort of full destruction. They were left alone, slowly eroding, gradually filling with wind-blown sand. The Egyptians of the 20th dynasty, a century later, had only the vaguest folk memory of what had happened at Amarna. The site was known to exist. It was associated with some kind of religious disturbance. It was avoided. The pharaohs of the period built no monuments there, they sent no missions there. They left it to the wind and the sand and the occasional band of looters who picked through the abandoned tombs in the cliffs for whatever portable goods they could find. The looting of the royal tombs east of the city had begun even before the city was fully abandoned. The tomb of Akhenaten himself, cut into a wadi several kilometers east of the central city, had been broken into and partially emptied within decades of his death. His sarcophagus had been smashed. The fragments survived, scattered through the chambers of the tomb, but the body itself had been removed. The same fate had probably befallen the tombs of the daughters who had been buried at Amarna, and possibly the tomb of Nefertiti herself, if such a tomb had ever been completed. What happened to the body of the queen at this point is one of the great unanswered questions of Egyptian archaeology. If she had been buried in the royal tomb at Amarna, her body had presumably been removed during the early looting, and it had been taken somewhere else. If she had not been buried at Amarna, then she had been buried somewhere else from the start, and that somewhere else has never been identified. The candidates have been narrowed down over the last 150 years of excavation, but no positive identification has yet been made. The most prominent candidate, supported by some scholars and rejected by others, is a mummy found in 1903 in a side chamber of the tomb of Amenhotep II in the Valley of the Kings, an old royal tomb that had been used during the 21st dynasty as a storage place for several mummies that had been moved from their original burials for safekeeping. The tomb of Amenhotep II is known by its modern catalog number as Tomb 35. The side chamber contained 3 unidentified mummies, 2 female and 1 male. The 2 female mummies are known, respectively, as the Elder Lady and the Younger Lady. The Elder Lady was identified in the early 2000s using a comparative DNA analysis as almost certainly Queen Tiye, the mother of Akhenaten. The Younger Lady has not been positively identified. She is younger than Tiye, possibly between 25 and 35 years old at death. She has suffered severe damage to the face, possibly inflicted before death, possibly inflicted shortly after death. Her nose has been smashed in. The lower half of her face has been broken away. The damage is so severe that the original features of the woman cannot be reconstructed from the surviving tissue. In 2003, the English Egyptologist Joanne Fletcher announced in a controversial publication and a subsequent television documentary that she believed the Younger Lady was Nefertiti. The evidence Fletcher cited included the shape of the skull, certain distinctive features of the ear, the presence of a depression on the head consistent with the wearing of a tight royal headdress, and an analysis of the apparent age of the body at death. The claim was immediately controversial. Other Egyptologists, including some of the most senior figures in the field, rejected the identification. Zahi Hawass, then the head of the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities, publicly disputed the claim. He argued that the body was too damaged for confident facial identification, that the age at death was inconsistent with the assumed lifespan of Nefertiti, and that the comparative material Fletcher had used was insufficient to support such a specific attribution. The dispute escalated into a public quarrel. Fletcher's permission to work in Egypt was suspended. Other scholars weighed in on both sides. In 2010, a more thorough DNA analysis of the royal mummies of the 18th dynasty was published. The analysis attempted to reconstruct the family relationships of a group of mummies, including Tutankhamun, Akhenaten, or his probable mummy, Queen Tiye, and the 2 unidentified ladies from Tomb 35. The results of the analysis indicated that the Younger Lady was the mother of Tutankhamun, and that she was also a sister of the man identified as Akhenaten. This meant that Tutankhamun had been born from a brother-sister marriage, which was not unusual in the Egyptian royal house, but which had implications for the identification of the body. If the Younger Lady was the sister of Akhenaten, then she was unlikely to be Nefertiti, who was not generally believed to have been Akhenaten's sister. Although the question was complicated by the close family marriages of the period, the DNA analysis did not settle the question. Some scholars accepted the results and concluded that the Younger Lady could not be Nefertiti. Others questioned the methodology of the analysis, pointing out that ancient DNA is notoriously difficult to extract from desiccated tissue, that contamination is a serious risk, that the sample sizes were small, and that the published results had not been independently replicated. The debate continued. As of the present writing, neither side has been able to definitively prove its case. The younger lady remains a candidate for the identity of Nefertiti, but a contested one. The body in the side chamber of Tomb 35 may be the most famous queen in Egyptian history, or it may be an unrelated royal woman whose name has been lost. There is currently no way to be certain. The other leading candidate emerged in 2015, from a direction that no one had been expecting. The English Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves had been studying high-resolution scans of the painted walls of the burial chamber of Tutankhamun, the famous burial known as Tomb 62, which had been discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, and which had become, in the centuries since, the single most famous archaeological site in Egypt. The Carter discovery itself merits a moment's attention because it shaped the context within which every subsequent question about the Amarna royal family would be asked. In the early years of the 20th century, the Valley of the Kings was generally believed to have been exhausted. Most of the royal tombs were known. Most had been entered in antiquity or in the recent past, and most had been emptied of their contents. The few tombs that had not yet been entered, it was generally assumed, were minor burials of obscure individuals, unlikely to produce significant finds. The American Theodore Davis, who held the concession to the valley from the 1890s through the early 1910s, had famously declared in his final excavation report that the valley contained nothing more worth digging for. He surrendered his concession shortly thereafter. The new concession was acquired by an English aristocrat, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, who funded the work of a young English Egyptologist named Howard Carter. Carter had been working in Egypt since the 1890s. He had served in various junior positions in the Antiquities Service. He had developed a reputation as a careful, methodical excavator with an unusually thorough approach to recording his finds. He had spent the better part of 2 decades in the Theban necropolis, mapping tombs, copying inscriptions, and gradually building up a comprehensive understanding of the archaeology of the area. By the time he began work for Lord Carnarvon, he had developed a private conviction that one royal tomb in the valley had not yet been found. The tomb, he believed, was that of Tutankhamun, the boy king whose name appeared in a small number of inscriptions, but whose burial had never been identified. Carter had specific reasons for this conviction. He had found, in various contexts in the valley, a series of objects bearing Tutankhamun's name, suggesting that the boy king's funerary equipment had at some point been disturbed and partially scattered. The objects implied the existence of a tomb that had not been completely emptied somewhere in the valley in a location that had not yet been investigated. Carter searched for the tomb, season after season, for years. He worked through a series of unproductive excavations. By the autumn of 1922, Lord Carnarvon had begun to lose patience. The expense of the work was substantial. The results, to that point, had been negligible. Carnarvon informed Carter that the upcoming season would be the last. If the tomb had not been found by the spring of 1923, the funding would be withdrawn. The season began in early November. On the 4th of November, 1922, a young water carrier in Carter's work crew, while clearing debris near the entrance of the already known tomb of Ramesses VI, struck the upper edge of a step cut into the bedrock. The step was followed by another and another. By the end of the day, Carter had exposed the top of a sealed doorway. The doorway carried the impressions of the royal necropolis seals. It had not been entered in antiquity in any thoroughgoing way. Carter halted the excavation. He sent a telegram to Carnarvon, in England, requesting his immediate presence. The famous message read approximately, "At last have made wonderful discovery in valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered. Same for your arrival. Congratulations." Carnarvon arrived in late November. The doorway was opened. Beyond it lay a corridor filled with rubble. The corridor was cleared over several days. At its end was a second sealed doorway. On the 26th of November, in the late afternoon, Carter made a small breach in the upper left corner of the second doorway, inserted a candle, and looked through. Carnarvon, standing behind him, asked what he could see. Carter's reply has become one of the most famous lines in the history of archaeology. He said, "Yes, wonderful things." The tomb beyond the doorway contained, in its 4 small chambers, the most complete royal burial assemblage ever recovered from ancient Egypt. There were chariots disassembled and stacked against the walls. There were beds carved in the shapes of strange composite animals. There were thrones and stools and gilded shrines. There were chests of clothing, of jewelry, of cosmetic equipment. There was a wooden mannequin of the boy king, dressed in his actual clothing, used as a stand for fitting his wardrobe. There were game boards, walking sticks, ceremonial weapons, and military equipment. The principal chamber contained the great nested shrines that surrounded the sarcophagus of the king himself. Inside the sarcophagus were 3 nested coffins, the innermost made of solid gold, weighing more than 100 kilograms. Inside the innermost coffin was the body of the boy king, his face covered by the gold mask that has become one of the most reproduced images of any object from antiquity. The excavation took 10 years. Carter and his team cataloged more than 5,000 individual objects from the tomb. Each object was photographed in place, drawn, described, and removed. The conservation work was extraordinary. The publication, when it appeared, ran to multiple volumes. The discovery transformed both academic Egyptology and the broader public understanding of ancient Egypt. The image of Tutankhamun's gold mask, distributed worldwide through the new mass media of the 1920s, became the iconic image of the entire civilization. The boy king, who had ruled briefly during the troubled aftermath of the Amarna Revolution and whose historical importance was relatively minor, became, by accident of preservation, the most famous of all the pharaohs. The discovery also had unexpected consequences for the study of the Amarna period. Many of the objects in Tutankhamun's tomb were not, originally, made for him. They had been made for other members of the royal family, in some cases including Akhenaten and Nefertiti themselves, and had been repurposed for the boy king's hasty burial. The reuse was visible. Inscriptions had been chiseled out and replaced. Cartouches had been altered. The face on the second of the 3 nested coffins, which clearly portrayed a king, did not match the face on the innermost coffin or on the gold mask. The differences had been noted at the time, but had not been fully explained. The hypothesis that the second coffin had been originally made for Nefertiti, in her capacity as pharaoh under the name Nefer-Neferutin, would only emerge much later, in the work of Reeves and others. In parallel with the Carter excavation, another major project of Amarna recovery was beginning at Karnak. The great temple complex on the eastern bank of the Nile at Thebes had been the principal religious establishment of the 18th dynasty, and Akhenaten, in the early years of his reign, had built a series of substantial temples to the Aten within its precincts. These temples had been demolished, along with the temples at Amarna itself, after the fall of the dynasty. The stone blocks from which they had been built, the small standardized blocks known as talatat, had been reused as fill in the construction of later pylons and walls at Karnak by the pharaohs of the 19th and 20th dynasties. The blocks were not destroyed, they were buried inside other structures. For 3,000 years they sat there, packed between the outer faces of later walls, their painted decoration preserved by the very fact of their burial. The systematic recovery of the talatat began in the 1920s and accelerated through the middle decades of the 20th century. Major projects under the auspices of the French Archaeological Institute, the Egyptian Antiquities Service, and various foreign expeditions extracted tens of thousands of these blocks from the later pylons at Karnak. The blocks, once extracted, were photographed and catalogued. The Akhenaten Temple Project, an American-led effort that began in the 1960s, undertook the enormous task of digitally and physically reassembling the original decorated walls from the surviving fragments. The work continues. To date, several thousand of the recovered talatat have been at least partially placed within reconstructions of the original wall scenes from the temples at Karnak. The reconstructed scenes are the principal source for the visual representation of Nefertiti in the early years of her reign, before the move to Amarna. She is depicted, on many of these blocks, performing rituals at the new temples to the Aten that her husband had constructed within the Karnak precinct. She is depicted at the same scale as the king. She is depicted in her own right, alone, without him, officiating at separate altars. She is depicted in the smiting scene that has already been mentioned, raising a weapon above a kneeling foreign captive. The scenes confirm, in considerable detail, that the elevated status she would hold at Amarna had been established already during the years at Thebes. The religious revolution and the elevation of the queen were not separable developments. They belonged together from the beginning. The recovery of the Talatat has also produced a series of more specific identifications. Some of the recovered blocks bear the cartouche of a queen whose name is given in the form Kia, a name that does not appear in any other known context. Kia appears to have been a secondary wife of Akhenaten, possibly a foreign princess, possibly the mother of Tutankhamun. Her name was systematically erased from the monuments of the period, possibly during her lifetime, possibly shortly afterward, in what may have been the first internal erasure within the Amarna royal family. The reasons for the erasure are not clear. Some scholars have suggested that Kia fell out of favor with the king, or that she was politically displaced by Nefertiti or by other rivals. Others have suggested that she died, and that the erasure was carried out by enemies who survived her. The questions remain open. What is clear is that the practice of removing the names and the images of disfavored members of the royal family from the monuments did not begin with the erasure of Akhenaten and Nefertiti after the fall of the dynasty. It had already begun within the dynasty itself, with the erasure of Kia. The chisels, when they were eventually turned against Nefertiti, were working in a tradition that had been established by her own court. The Carter excavation had been exhaustive. Every surface of the tomb had been photographed, measured, catalogued, and published. Nothing about Tomb 62, it was assumed, remained to be discovered. The walls were painted, the chambers were known, the burial was complete. Reeves was not looking for new chambers when he began his analysis. He was studying the painted decoration of the burial chamber, trying to understand the iconographic program. What he noticed, when he examined the scans closely, was that certain features of the painted walls appeared to be inconsistent with the underlying stone. There were faint linear features visible through the plaster, features that seemed to follow geometric patterns consistent with the presence of sealed doorways. Reeves became convinced that the north wall and the west wall of the burial chamber concealed two previously unknown sealed entrances, leading to chambers that had not been entered since the original burial. In a paper published in 2015, Reeves proposed a startling hypothesis. The tomb of Tutankhamun, he argued, was not the original tomb of Tutankhamun at all. It was a tomb that had been prepared for Nefertiti in her capacity as pharaoh, and that had been hurriedly repurposed for Tutankhamun when he died unexpectedly at a young age. The repurposing had involved partitioning off the front chambers for Tutankhamun's burial and sealing the back chambers, where Nefertiti herself had been buried, behind plastered walls that were then painted over with the standard funerary scenes. If Reeves was right, then Nefertiti's body had been lying behind a painted wall in the world's most famous tomb for almost 100 years, while millions of tourists filed past her unknowingly. The hypothesis attracted enormous attention. The Egyptian government authorized a series of investigations. The first investigation, in late 2015, used infrared thermography to detect temperature differentials in the walls of the burial chamber. The results suggested that there were anomalies behind the walls, consistent with the presence of hidden cavities. The second investigation, in 2016, used ground-penetrating radar. The results of this second scan were ambiguous, with some readings suggesting the presence of cavities and others showing no anomalies. A third investigation, conducted in 2018 by an Italian team using multiple radar systems with much finer spatial resolution, found no evidence of hidden chambers at all. The third survey appeared to definitively refute the Reeves hypothesis. The debate did not end there. Reeves and his supporters pointed out that the different radar surveys had been conducted with different equipment, at different settings, by different teams, and had produced contradictory results. They argued that the third survey, while more technically sophisticated, had not necessarily looked in the right places. They continued to publish refinements of the original hypothesis. A fourth radar survey, conducted in 2020 by yet another team, again suggested the presence of an anomaly, possibly a corridor running parallel to the burial chamber. The results were inconclusive but not negative. In 2025, at the 4th Annual International Tutankhamun Conference at the Grand Egyptian Museum near Giza, a statement was released on behalf of the Egyptian Antiquities Authority. The statement reported the results of yet another investigation. The conclusion was that no hidden chambers adjacent to Tomb 62 had been detected. The investigation that had begun in 2015, the statement implied, was now closed. There were no chambers, there was no hidden burial. Nefertiti was not behind the wall of Tutankhamun's tomb. The supporters of the Reeves hypothesis did not accept this conclusion. They argued that the announcement was based on incomplete data, that further investigation was warranted, that the absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. The debate continued in academic journals and at conferences, although with reduced public attention. The momentum that had carried the hypothesis through its first decade had largely dissipated. The mainstream of Egyptology had moved on. The body of Nefertiti, if it survived, was presumably somewhere else. Where exactly that somewhere else might be is the question that occupies the present generation of Amarna scholars. The candidates have been narrowed but not eliminated. The royal tomb at Amarna remains a possibility, although the chambers that have been excavated there contain no trace of her. The unfinished tombs in the nearby wadis remain possibilities, although none has yet produced any identifiable royal material. The Valley of the Kings remains a possibility, although the systematic surveys conducted over the last century have found no unidentified royal tomb that could plausibly belong to her. The royal cache at Deir el-Bahri, where many mummies of the New Kingdom pharaohs were reburied during the 21st dynasty after their original tombs had been violated, remains a possibility, although the inventory of that cache does not include any body identified as Nefertiti. The unidentified mummies from Tomb 35 remain possibilities, although none has been positively identified. The younger lady remains the most prominent candidate, but the identification is contested. The active search continues. A small number of archaeologists work, year by year, on the assumption that the body is still out there, still recoverable, still waiting to be found. The Dominican archaeologist Kathleen Martinez has been excavating for many years at the temple complex of Taposiris Magna on the Mediterranean coast west of Alexandria, working on the hypothesis that the tomb of Cleopatra VII might be found there. Her work is not directly aimed at Nefertiti, but her excavations, and others like them, keep alive the possibility that important New Kingdom and Ptolemaic royal burials might still be discovered in unexpected locations. Zahi Hawass, the longtime senior figure in Egyptian archaeology, has continued to publish work on the royal mummies of the 18th dynasty and to advance his own hypotheses about the identifications of the disputed bodies. His position on the younger lady has shifted somewhat over the years. He has, at various points, suggested that the body might in fact be Nefertiti after all, although he has also continued to express skepticism about the available evidence. The search for Nefertiti, in other words, is not finished. It has been going on, in one form or another, for more than a century and a half, since the rediscovery of the Amarna site by the Prussian expedition of 1843. It has produced a steady stream of partial answers, contested claims, hopeful hypotheses, and disappointed conclusions. It has not yet produced a body. The most famous queen in Egyptian history remains, in the most literal sense, missing. To understand how the search came to this point, and why the question of where her body lies has remained unanswered for so long, it is necessary to go back to the world she actually inhabited, and to look more closely at what was built there, what was said there, and what was eventually swept away. The new capital at Amarna, in its peak years, occupied a long, narrow strip of land along the eastern bank of the Nile, roughly 13 kilometers in length and about a kilometer wide at its broadest. The city was bounded on the east by the cliffs that formed the natural amphitheater enclosing the site, and on the west by the river itself. There was a central religious and administrative district where the great temples of the Aten stood alongside the palaces of the royal family. There was a northern district where the older palace complex was located, possibly used by the king as a private residence before the central city was fully built. There was a southern district of smaller houses, workshops, and gardens. There was a workmen's village, walled off from the main city, where the laborers who cut the rock tombs in the eastern cliffs lived in close-packed mud brick houses arranged in tidy rows. The whole place was built quickly. The mud bricks were stamped, in many cases, with the cartouches of Akhenaten or with the name of the Aten. The plaster walls were painted in bright colors, with floral motifs, with images of birds and water, with friezes of grapes and pomegranates and figs. The floors of the principal rooms in the palaces were covered with paintings of pools and marshes, complete with fish and ducks, so that a visitor walking across the floor would feel as if walking across the surface of a river. The temples of the Aten were unlike any religious structures Egypt had ever built. The great temple at the center of the city was an open-air complex, a vast walled enclosure containing dozens of small chapels arranged in long rows, each chapel containing an altar onto which offerings could be placed. The whole structure was designed so that the sun could fall directly onto the altars from above. There were no covered sanctuaries, there were no inner shrines, there were no statues of the god, because the god was the sun itself, and no representation was permitted. The traditional Egyptian temple, with its concealed inner sanctuary where a single divine image was housed, and from which the god was processed out only on festival days, had been turned inside out. The Aten was always present. The Aten was the source of all visible reality. The Aten did not need a hidden sanctuary, because the Aten could not be hidden. The worship took place in the open. The king and the queen, accompanied by their daughters and by the priests of the new cult, would enter the temple at dawn. They would proceed along the central avenue between the rows of altars. They would offer bouquets of flowers, loaves of bread, jars of wine, joints of meat, the standard offerings of the Egyptian religious tradition, but they would offer them to the disk of the sun rather than to a sequestered cult image. The hands of the rays of the sun, in the official iconography of the period, would descend toward the offerings and receive them. The king would speak the hymns, the queen would stand beside him. The daughters would shake the sacred rattles called sistra. The atmosphere of the new temples was bright, open, public. It was a religious experience designed to be witnessed rather than concealed. The principal text associated with the Aten cult, the so-called Great Hymn to the Aten, has survived in fragments inscribed on the walls of one of the rock-cut tombs of the elite at Amarna, the tomb of a courtier named Ai, the same Ai, who is generally believed to have been Nefertiti's father, and who would later, after the fall of the dynasty, become pharaoh himself. The text of the hymn is one of the most remarkable religious documents of the ancient world. It describes the Aten as the sole creator of all things, the maker of the seasons, the giver of the breath of life to every creature on earth. It celebrates the daily rising of the sun as the renewal of the world. It describes the lands beyond Egypt, the foreign peoples with their different languages and their different skin colors, as also being the creatures of the Aten, whose care extends to all humanity. The hymn does not mention any of the older Egyptian gods. It does not mention Amun, or Ptah, or Osiris, or Re, or any of the other deities of the traditional pantheon. The Aten is presented as alone, supreme, universal. The hymn is, by any reasonable definition, a monotheistic religious text. It has been compared, often, to the 104th Psalm of the Hebrew Bible, which it resembles in certain striking respects of phrasing and structure. The historical relationship between the two texts, if any, is a question that has been argued for over a century and has never been resolved. The question of how Akhenaten's theology should be understood in relation to the broader religious history of the ancient world has been one of the most argued questions in the modern scholarly literature on the Amarna period. The hymn presents itself, on its face, as a monotheistic text. The Aten is the only god named. The Aten is described as the creator of all things, the universal source of life. The Aten's activity is described in terms that, in their generosity and scope, do not depend on any of the conventional Egyptian polytheistic frameworks. The hymn does not mention the 9 gods of the Ennead. It does not invoke Osiris in the context where Osiris would have been expected. It does not address the night journey of the sun through the underworld, the central theological problem of the older solar tradition. The night, in the hymn, is simply the absence of the Aten, a time of darkness during which the world falls silent and the wild animals come out. There is no underworld journey. There is no struggle of the sun god against the chaos serpent in the depths of the night. The Aten is, theologically, a much simpler deity than any of the gods of the older Egyptian pantheon. This simplicity was, by the standards of the older religion, an impoverishment. The older Egyptian gods had complex personalities, histories, family relationships, attributes, and powers. They participated in narratives that were thousands of years old. They had specific local associations with particular cities, particular temples, particular natural features. They were, taken together, an enormously rich theological inheritance. The Aten, by comparison, was abstract. The Aten had no personality beyond the qualities of light and warmth. The Aten had no narrative. The Aten had no family beyond the king and the queen who had been designated as the divine intermediaries. The Aten was, in modern terms, a philosophical concept that had been promoted to the status of a god, and the rituals of the new cult were the rituals appropriate to a philosophical concept rather than to a personality. The temples were open, the ceremonies were brief, the offerings were generic. The whole apparatus of the older religion, with its specific cult statues and its closed inner sanctuaries and its mystery-laden processional rituals, had been replaced by something cleaner, simpler, and considerably less satisfying to most of the people who had been brought up in the older tradition. The novelty of this theological position has been recognized since the earliest modern study of the Amarna period. The American Egyptologist James Henry Breasted, writing in the first decade of the 20th century, described Akhenaten as the first individual in human history, the first thinker who could be identified by name as having generated a coherent philosophical, religious vision, rather than simply transmitting the inherited tradition. Breasted's characterization has been challenged since, both for its tendency toward anachronism and for its implicit assumption that monotheism represented a kind of religious progress that other traditions had not yet attained. But the basic recognition that the Aten cult was something different from what had preceded it has remained the consensus position. Whether the difference was an advance or a regression depends, of course, on the criteria of evaluation and on the broader assumptions one brings to the question of what religion is supposed to do. The relationship between the Aten cult and later Near Eastern monotheism has been the subject of a separate and even more contested debate. The most famous and most controversial intervention in this debate was that of Sigmund Freud, whose final book, Moses and Monotheism, published in 1939, argued that the historical Moses had been an Egyptian priest of the Aten, who, after the collapse of the Amarna experiment, had carried the monotheistic faith to the Hebrew tribes in Egypt, and had taught them the religion that would eventually develop into Judaism. Freud's argument was a synthesis of his own psychoanalytic theory with the available archaeological and biblical evidence, and it depended on chronological assumptions that were never universally accepted. The biblical chronology of the Exodus is itself disputed. The historicity of Moses as an individual is disputed. The connection between the Atnas theology and the early Hebrew religion, if any, depends on a series of hypotheses that cannot be independently verified. Freud's book was received, on its publication, with skepticism by both Egyptologists and biblical scholars, and the specific reconstruction he proposed has never been adopted by mainstream scholarship. What has persisted, however, is the broader question of whether the Atenist experiment had any historical influence on the subsequent development of monotheistic religion in the Near East. The argument has been pursued, in various forms, by a series of subsequent scholars. The German Egyptologist Jan Assmann, in a series of books published in the 1990s and the early 2000s, argued that the Amarna period represented a fundamental rupture in the religious history of the ancient world, the moment at which the older distinction between true and false gods was first articulated. Assmann's argument did not depend on a direct transmission from Akhenaten to Moses. It depended on the recognition that the Aten cult had introduced a new theological vocabulary, a vocabulary of exclusivity and universality that would subsequently be available to other religious traditions, whether or not they could trace a direct historical connection to its Egyptian origin. The vocabulary, once introduced, could be reinvented. The exclusivity, once theorized, could be appropriated. The shape of the argument that Akhenaten and his priests had constructed could be reused by later thinkers without their needing to know whose original argument they were reusing. The Canadian Egyptologist Donald Redford, who has been one of the most active modern scholars on the Amarna period, has been more skeptical about the possibility of direct historical influence. Redford has argued that the Atnas experiment was too short, too narrowly confined to the immediate royal circle at Amarna, and too thoroughly erased after the fall of the dynasty to have served as a vector for any subsequent transmission. The Aten cult, in Redford's view, was a closed episode in the religious history of Egypt, a brief experiment that left no detectable trace in any later religious tradition. The resemblances between the Great Hymn and certain biblical psalms, Redford has argued, are most economically explained as parallel responses to the universal human experience of sunrise, sunset, and the daily rhythms of agricultural life, rather than as evidence of direct literary influence. The debate is unresolved. It will probably remain unresolved, because the evidence that would be required to settle it does not exist and is unlikely to be recovered. What can be said with confidence is that the Aten cult was, within Egypt and during the brief period of its official establishment, a genuinely monotheistic religious system, and that its eventual collapse and erasure removed from the historical record a particular intellectual development whose later influence, if any, must be reconstructed from indirect evidence rather than from continuous documentation. The queen who had stood beside the king during the establishment of that system was, in this larger context, a participant in one of the most ambitious theological experiments ever attempted in the ancient world. Her erasure was not merely the erasure of an individual queen, it was the erasure of a co-architect of a religious revolution. What is certain is that the hymn was composed at Amarna, during the reign of Akhenaten, by someone in the immediate circle of the royal family. It may have been composed by the king himself, who is described in the inscriptions of the period as the sole prophet of the Aten and as the only one who truly understood the new theology. It may have been composed by Nefertiti, although there is no direct attribution to her. It may have been composed by a priest or a scribe whose name has not survived. It was set down in writing in the early years of the new capital, and it was reproduced in the tombs of the elite as a kind of canonical statement of the faith that the king required them to share. Whoever composed it, the hymn presents a vision of the divine that is genuinely new in the religious history of the ancient world. The Aten is not a tribal god. The Aten is not the god of Egypt specifically. The Aten is the god of every living thing under the sun, including the lion in the desert, the duck in the marsh, the child in the womb, the foreign king in his distant palace. The hymn imagines the daily activities of all these creatures as being directly enabled by the warmth and the light of the sun. When the sun rises, the lion goes back to its lair to sleep. The cattle are content in their pastures. The fish leap up in the river. The ships sail down the Nile. The eyes of human beings open. When the sun sets, all of these activities cease. The world falls silent. The thieves come out of their hiding places. The lion emerges to hunt. Then the sun rises again, and the cycle resumes. The vision is large, generous, optimistic. It is also, in its way, deeply hierarchical. The hymn is clear that there are only two beings who fully understand the Aten, and who serve as the intermediaries between the god and humanity. Those two beings are the king and the queen. Everyone else, in the new theology, is required to worship the Aten through them. The ordinary citizen of Amarna did not pray directly to the disk of the sun. The ordinary citizen prayed to the king and the queen, who in turn prayed to the Aten. The result was a religious structure in which the royal couple occupied an unprecedented position. They were not merely the rulers of Egypt. They were the only legitimate channel through which the divine could be addressed. This had practical consequences. Inside the houses of the courtiers and officials at Amarna, archaeologists have found small domestic shrines. The shrines contained, at their center, not images of any traditional god, but images of the royal family. The king and the queen were depicted seated together, with their daughters playing at their feet, surrounded by the rays of the Aten descending from above. Citizens were expected to make offerings to these family portraits as part of their daily religious practice. The royal family was, in a literal sense, the household god of the new capital. To worship at home was to worship them. The queen's position, in this arrangement was as elevated as the king's. She was depicted at the same scale. She was depicted performing the same rituals. She was depicted in some surviving images, alone, without her husband, receiving offerings from the rays of the sun in her own right. She wore the tall blue crown of pharaonic authority. She wore the false beard of the king on certain ceremonial occasions, indicated in some reliefs by the chin strap that held the beard in place. She rode in chariots. She held weapons. She is depicted, in at least one surviving fragment, in the act of executing a foreign prisoner, holding a curved sword above the kneeling figure as the rays of the Aten descend to give legitimacy to her action. The visual language of pharaonic kingship had been extended to her in a way it had been extended to no previous queen. The reasons for this extension are not entirely clear. It may have reflected a genuine ideological commitment on the part of Akhenaten to elevate his queen to a co-equal position. It may have reflected practical political reality, with Nefertiti taking on increasing administrative responsibilities as the king focused on his religious program. It may have reflected the theology of the Aten itself, which was sometimes described as containing within itself both masculine and feminine principles, and which might have required a divine couple to express both aspects on earth. It may have reflected a combination of all of these factors. Whatever the cause, the result was a queen with a level of visible power that was, in Egyptian terms, unprecedented. Outside the city, beyond the boundary stele, the rest of Egypt continued more or less as before. The provincial administration continued to function. The harvest was collected. The trade routes were maintained. The army was kept up. The diplomatic correspondence with foreign powers was carried on. The kingdom did not fall apart because the king had moved his capital to a new location and changed the official religion. But the new arrangements were not popular outside of the king's immediate circle. The temples of Amun and Karnak had been closed, but the priests who had served those temples had not disappeared. They had been displaced. They had been left without their accustomed income, their accustomed honors, their accustomed authority. They were still alive. They were still organized. They were waiting. The diplomatic correspondence of the period, preserved on the clay tablets, known as the Amarna letters, gives a vivid picture of the foreign relations of the empire during these years. Hundreds of letters survive, written in the Akkadian language using the cuneiform script that was the lingua franca of Bronze Age Near Eastern diplomacy. The letters were sent to Akhenaten by foreign kings, both the great kings of equal status with the Egyptian pharaoh, the rulers of Babylon and Mitanni, and the Hittites and Assyria, and the lesser kings of the vassal states in Syria and Canaan that were subject to Egyptian overlordship. The letters are remarkable for their tone. The great kings address Akhenaten as a brother. They send him gifts. They ask him for gifts in return. They complain about the gifts he sends. They negotiate marriages. They discuss the prices of horses and lapis lazuli. They gossip about the deaths and the marriages and the political maneuvers of their own courts. The vassal kings, by contrast, write in tones of abject panic. The Egyptian empire in the Levant was beginning, in this period, to come under serious pressure from outside. The Hittites were expanding southward. Local rulers were turning on each other and on their Egyptian overlords. Cities were being lost. The vassal letters from this period are full of urgent requests for military assistance. The local rulers write that the cities of the king are being taken. They write that the king's lands are being eaten up. They write that they have sent letter after letter and have received no reply. They beg for soldiers, for grain, for arms. The replies from the Egyptian court, when they came at all, were generally diplomatic and non-committal. The military assistance that was requested was generally not provided. The empire was slowly bleeding, and the king at Amarna was apparently more preoccupied with the theology of the disk than with the practical defense of his foreign possessions. This has been used by some historians as evidence that Akhenaten was a poor administrator, distracted by religious obsession from the proper duties of a pharaoh. Other historians have argued that the picture is misleading, that the Egyptian empire was facing pressures that no pharaoh could have entirely managed, and that Akhenaten's apparent neglect of the vassal states reflected a deliberate strategic decision to consolidate Egyptian power closer to home rather than to expend resources on distant possessions. The debate is ongoing. What is clear is that during the years when the great temples of the Aten were being built at Amarna and the new theology was being elaborated by the king and the queen, the territorial extent of the Egyptian empire was contracting at the edges, and the vassal kings of the Levant were writing increasingly desperate letters to a court that was no longer answering. In the workshops of Amarna, while the diplomatic correspondence accumulated in the archives, the artisans of the new style were producing the images of the royal family that would survive, in fragments, into modern times. The sculptors worked in plaster, in limestone, in granite, in sandstone, in quartzite. They made statues of the king at every scale, from small votive figurines to colossi several meters in height. They made statues of the queen, fewer in number but more striking in execution. They made statues of the daughters. They made reliefs for the walls of the temples and the palaces. They made stelae for private homes, on which the royal family was depicted in the intimate domestic scenes that were one of the most distinctive innovations of the period. The king is shown holding a daughter on his lap, kissing her on the mouth. The queen is shown nursing an infant. The royal couple is shown sitting together, drinking from a shared cup. These scenes have no precedent in earlier Egyptian art, which had always depicted the royal family in stiff, hieratic poses, looking out at the viewer rather than at each other. The Amarna art shows people looking at each other. The intimacy is startling. It still is, after 3,000 years. The most famous of the Amarna sculptors was a man named Thutmose. His workshop has been excavated. It was located in the southern part of the central city, on a quiet street, in a complex of buildings that included his residence, the workshop proper, and storerooms for finished and unfinished pieces. When the city was abandoned, Thutmose evidently left in a hurry. He did not take his finished work with him. He did not take the models from which his work was made. He left them all in the workshop, locked up behind a wall of mud bricks that he or someone in his household plastered shut as the last act before departure. The plaster held, the bricks held. The contents of the workshop sat undisturbed in the dry desert air for more than 3,200 years. In the winter of 1912, a German archaeological expedition, under the direction of the Egyptologist Ludwig Borchardt, was excavating in the southern part of the central city of Amarna. The expedition was working under a concession agreement with the Egyptian Antiquities Service, which at the time was under the administration of the French Egyptologist Gaston Maspero. The agreement, as was standard at the time, provided that fines would be divided between the excavating expedition and the Egyptian Museum, with the more significant pieces generally retained by Egypt, and the secondary pieces allowed to go to the foreign expedition for export. On the 6th of December, the expedition's workers were clearing a particular room in a complex they had identified, from inscriptions found nearby, as belonging to the sculptor Thutmose. They broke through into a small storeroom. Inside the storeroom, on a shelf along one wall, lay a series of plaster busts and a single, almost intact, painted limestone bust of a woman. The woman wore a tall, flat-topped blue crown. Her face was calm. Her left eye socket was empty. The crystal and beeswax inlay that should have filled it had never been installed or had been removed at some point in the ancient working process. The right eye was intact, with the iris of brown stone gazing forward into the storeroom. The skin of the face was painted a warm, pale brown. The lips were a deep red. The neck was long. The chin was set. The expression was difficult to read. It was the face of a woman who had seen a great deal and was no longer surprised by any of it. Borchardt knew, almost immediately, what he had found. The face matched the descriptions of Nefertiti from the inscriptions of the period. The bust was a master sculptor's model, kept in the workshop as a reference from which other portraits could be produced. It was the most complete surviving image of the queen. Borchardt also knew almost immediately that he wanted the bust to go to Berlin rather than to Cairo. The negotiations that followed have been the subject of dispute ever since. According to the official inventory presented by Borchardt to the Egyptian authorities for the division of fines, the bust was described in terms that minimized its significance. It was listed as a plaster bust of a princess, without specification of the painted surface, without mention of its near-complete state of preservation, without acknowledgement that it might be a portrait of the queen. The Egyptian inspector who reviewed the inventory apparently accepted the description without examining the object closely. The bust was assigned to the German share. It was packed for shipment. It was sent to Berlin. The decision was made on arrival, to keep the bust out of public view. It was not displayed, it was not photographed for publication. It was kept in the private collection of the financier who had funded Borchart's expedition, a man named James Simon, who eventually donated it to the Berlin Museum in 1920. Even after the donation, the bust was not displayed publicly for several more years. The first public exhibition, in 1924, was an immediate sensation. The face was reproduced in newspapers and magazines around the world. It became, almost overnight, one of the most recognized images of any object from antiquity. Postcards of it were sold by the millions. Reproductions of it appeared in every art history textbook of the 20th century. The face of Nefertiti, hidden in the workshop of Thutmose for 30 centuries and then quietly extracted from Egypt under questionable documentation, became the public face of ancient Egypt for the modern world. The Egyptian government has been requesting the return of the bust to Egypt for over 100 years. The requests have been formal and repeated. The Egyptian position has consistently been that the bust was acquired by Germany under fraudulent or at least misleading documentation, and that it should be returned to its country of origin. The German position has consistently been that the bust was legally acquired under the rules in force at the time, that the documentation was reviewed and approved by the Egyptian authorities, and that the bust forms an important part of the collection of the Berlin Museum. Neither position has moved. The bust remains in Berlin. It is currently displayed in the newest museum, where it occupies a dedicated room on the upper floor, lit from above so that the visible right eye catches the light at the angle for which the sculptor designed it. Roughly 500,000 visitors view it each year. None of them is permitted to photograph it. The bust has had a complicated history within Germany itself. After its first public display in 1924, it became, almost immediately, an object of intense political and cultural attention. It was admired by ordinary visitors. It was studied by artists. It was photographed for publication. It was lectured upon by Egyptologists and by art historians. By the late 1920s, it had been incorporated into the visual culture of the Weimar Republic as a symbol of refined cosmopolitan taste. Reproductions of it appeared in private homes throughout Berlin. Smaller versions of it were sold in museum shops and in tourist establishments throughout the city. When the National Socialist regime came to power in 1933, the bust acquired a different kind of significance. Adolf Hitler is reported to have been personally fascinated by it. He had it removed, on at least one occasion, from public display so that he could view it in private. He is alleged to have made remarks praising its beauty and its dignity, and to have expressed a desire that it remain permanently in German hands. Whether these reports are accurate in their details is a matter of some dispute, but the broad outline is reasonably well documented. The bust, like much of the rest of the Berlin Egyptian collection, was treated by the National Socialist authorities as a national treasure to be protected and preserved at all costs. During the Second World War, the bust was evacuated from the Berlin Museum complex for safekeeping. It was moved, along with thousands of other objects from the city's various museum collections, to a series of remote and supposedly secure locations in the German countryside. For much of the war, the bust was stored in a flak tower in the Berlin Zoo, a massive, reinforced concrete structure designed both as an anti-aircraft position and as a bomb shelter. As the bombing of Berlin intensified in the final years of the war, the contents of the flak tower were moved again, this time to a salt mine in Thuringia in central Germany. The mine, at a place called Merkers, was used by the German authorities to store, in addition to the Berlin Museum collection, large quantities of gold reserves from the Reichsbank and substantial holdings of paper currency, foreign exchange, and miscellaneous valuables that had been seized from across occupied Europe. The mine was captured by American forces in April of 1945. The recovery of its contents was one of the most extraordinary scenes of the closing weeks of the war in Europe. American soldiers, descending into the mine with electric lamps, found rooms stacked from floor to ceiling with crates of cash, with bags of gold coins, with paintings by old masters, with sculptures from the great national collections of multiple European countries, and, in one specific chamber, with a painted limestone bust of a queen who had died 3,300 years earlier in a city on the Nile. The bust, when recovered, was undamaged. It was held by the American military authorities for several years, while the question of its eventual disposition was negotiated. It was eventually returned to West German authorities and placed in the collection of the Egyptian Museum in West Berlin. After the reunification of Germany in 1990 and the subsequent reorganization of the Berlin Museum collections, the bust was eventually moved to the Neues Museum on Museum Island in the central city, where it has been displayed since 2009 in a dedicated room designed specifically for its presentation. The Egyptian requests for its return have continued throughout this entire period. The first formal Egyptian request was made in 1925, shortly after the bust's first public display. The Egyptian authorities argued that the export had been irregular and that the bust should be repatriated. The German authorities declined. Further requests were made in the 1930s, when the bust's political prominence in National Socialist cultural propaganda became an additional source of Egyptian grievance. The German authorities again declined. Requests were made in the 1950s, in the 1960s, in the 1970s, and in every subsequent decade. The Egyptian position has consistently been that the bust is a national treasure of Egypt, that it was acquired by Germany under circumstances that would not have been permitted under modern antiquities law, and that it should be returned. The German position has consistently been that the acquisition was legal at the time, that the bust has now been in Germany for more than a century, and that any precedent for repatriation would have unmanageable consequences for the museum collections of Germany and of other European countries. The most prominent of the modern Egyptian campaigns for repatriation was led by Zahi Hawass during his tenure as Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities in the 2000s and the early 2010s. Hawass made the bust one of his signature targets, alongside the Rosetta Stone in the British Museum and the Dendera Zodiac in the Louvre. He made formal demands. He gave press interviews. He proposed exhibitions. He threatened to ban future archaeological cooperation with the holding institutions. The German authorities held firm. The bust did not move. After Hawass's removal from his position during the political turmoil of the early 2010s, the repatriation campaign lost momentum. The matter has been raised periodically since then, but has not produced any change in the bust's location. It remains in Berlin. The fact that it remains in Berlin is itself, in a curious way, part of the larger pattern of erasure that has accompanied Nefertiti's modern reception. Her physical body, if it survives, is missing. Her face, in the bust, is preserved, but the face is held in a country that is not her own, by an institution that does not propose to return it, in a city that she never visited and that did not exist when she was alive. The most concrete surviving artifact of her existence is permanently displaced from the place where she lived and died. The arrangement is, in its own way, a continuation of the disruption that began 3,000 years ago when the chiselers were sent to remove her image from the temples of Amarna. They did not succeed in removing the image. They succeeded only in dispersing it. The dispersal continues. The bust is not Nefertiti. It is an image of Nefertiti, made during her lifetime by an artist who knew her face. It is the closest surviving approach to her physical reality. But it is not her body. Her body, wherever it is somewhere else. The search for the body has run, in parallel with the history of the bust, throughout the modern excavation of Amarna and the related sites in the Valley of the Kings. The Amarna site itself was first systematically mapped by a Prussian expedition under Richard Lepsius in 1843. Lepsius produced a careful topographic survey of the site and recorded many of the inscriptions in the rock-cut tombs of the elite in the eastern cliffs. He copied the boundary stelae. He drew the surviving architecture. His published volumes, the Denkmaler aus Ägypten and Ethiopian, remain a foundational source for the study of the period. Lepsius did not, however, find any royal tomb that could be identified as belonging to Nefertiti. The royal tomb of Akhenaten, cut into a remote wadi several kilometers east of the central city, was eventually identified in 1881 by local villagers and was first systematically examined by the French Egyptologist Alessandro Barsanti in 1891. The tomb had been thoroughly looted. The sarcophagus of Akhenaten had been smashed. Fragments of his canopic chest, the vessel that would have held his internal organs, were recovered. His body was not found. The royal tomb contained chambers that may have been intended for the burial of the queen and the daughters, but none of those chambers contained any identifiable remains. The site of Amarna itself was excavated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by a series of expeditions of varying sponsorship and varying methodology. The English archaeologist Flinders Petrie, who would later be considered the founding figure of scientific Egyptian archaeology, worked at the site in 1891 and 1892. He produced the first detailed inventory of the surviving architecture and the small finds. He recovered fragments of glass and faience, painted plaster from the palaces, fragments of inscriptions, and innumerable potsherds. His work established the basic chronological framework within which all subsequent excavation at the site has been conducted. Later expeditions, including the German expedition under Borchardt, the English expedition of the Egypt Exploration Society, and a series of subsequent campaigns continuing into the present day, have extended and refined Petrie's work without fundamentally altering it. The picture of Amarna as a planned city, occupied for a single generation, abandoned in a hurry, and systematically dismantled after abandonment, has held up under more than a century of investigation. Petrie's work at Amarna was foundational in ways that went beyond the recovery of objects. His seasons there established the methodology that would govern the scientific archaeology of the entire site. He was working at a moment in the development of the discipline when the practice of careful stratigraphic excavation was still being invented, and his choices at Amarna influenced the way subsequent expeditions would approach the recording of finds and the analysis of context. He insisted that even the smallest fragments of pottery be recovered and catalogued, on the theory that the typological analysis of common ceramic wares could be used to establish relative chronologies even in the absence of inscribed material. The technique, which Petrie called sequence dating and which he developed over the course of his Egyptian career, was one of the founding methodologies of modern archaeology. The principal architectural discoveries of his Amarna seasons included the Great Palace Complex in the central city, with its painted floors showing pools and birds and waterfowl, and the workshop of the royal artisans, which would later be re-excavated in greater detail by the German expedition under Borchardt. Petrie recovered, from the workshop area, fragments of plaster casts of royal portraits, including casts that may have served as preliminary studies for the famous limestone bust that Borchardt would eventually find on another shelf in the same complex. He recovered ostraca, the inscribed potsherds and limestone flakes used as scratch paper in the ancient administration. He recovered fragments of glass, faience, and the elaborate inlaid jewelry that the Amarna workshops had produced in large quantities. He produced, on the basis of these finds, the first comprehensive published description of the abandoned city, which appeared as a monograph titled Tel el Amarna in 1894, and which remained the standard reference work for the next generation of scholars. Petrie was followed at Amarna by the Egypt Exploration Society, the English archaeological organization that had been founded in the 1880s to support systematic excavation in Egypt. The Society's first major Amarna expedition, beginning in 1901 and continuing intermittently through the early 20th century, was directed initially by Norman de Garis Davies, whose principal contribution was the careful copying of the painted and carved reliefs in the rock-cut tombs of the elite in the eastern cliffs. Davies's published volumes, The Rock Tombs of El Amarna, appeared in 6 volumes between 1903 and 1908, and they constitute the definitive record of the tomb art at the site. Many of the reliefs that Davies recorded have since deteriorated significantly as a result of weathering, vandalism, and the gradual collapse of the soft limestone in which the tombs were cut. Davies's copies are now, in many cases, the only record of inscriptions and scenes that were intact in his time but are no longer accessible. Howard Carter, who would later become famous for the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, worked briefly at Amarna in his early career as an assistant to Davies and to other senior excavators. His specific contributions to the Amarna documentation are limited, but his experience at the site appears to have shaped his thinking about the politics of the late 18th dynasty and to have prepared him for the eventual discovery, 20 years later, of the burial of the boy king whose reign had marked the end of the Amarna experiment. The German expedition under Borchardt, beginning in 1907 and continuing through the discovery of the bust in 1912, and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, conducted the most thorough re-excavation of the central city that had yet been attempted. The German team mapped the residential districts in considerable detail. They identified the houses of specific named officials by tracing their inscriptions in the surviving plaster. They produced the architectural plans of the workshops, the palaces, and the temples that are still consulted by modern scholars. The German work was interrupted by the war and was not resumed by the same expedition afterward, but the published results, when they eventually appeared in the 1920s and 1930s, established a level of architectural documentation that subsequent expeditions have built upon rather than replaced. The Egypt Exploration Society returned to Amarna in 1921 and conducted a series of major campaigns under the successive direction of T.E. Peat, Henri Frankfurt, and John D.S. Pendlebury through the 1920s and into the 1930s. The Pendlebury campaigns in particular focused on the central city and on the so-called North Palace, a separate royal residence at the northern end of the site that had been less thoroughly investigated by earlier expeditions. Pendlebury's published reports remain among the principal sources for the architecture and the daily life of the abandoned capital. His career was cut short by the Second World War. He was killed in 1941 during the German invasion of Crete, where he had been working in a military intelligence capacity. His unpublished notes from the final Amarna seasons were lost during the war. Some of the information that he had recorded but had not yet published has been permanently lost. The most sustained modern excavation at Amarna has been the Amarna Project, an English archaeological program directed since 1977 by Barry Kemp of the University of Cambridge. The Amarna Project has been working at the site continuously, with brief interruptions, for almost 50 years. Its excavations have focused, in particular, on the residential and industrial districts of the ancient city rather than on the central royal precinct, on the assumption that the daily life of the ordinary inhabitants of Amarna can be reconstructed from the material remains of their houses, workshops, and burials in ways that would not be possible from the elite contexts alone. The project has uncovered, in the southern suburbs, the houses of middle-ranking officials and craftspeople. It has documented the bread-baking installations of the royal kitchens, the glass workshops, the faience furnaces, and the small private chapels in which the ordinary citizens of the new capital conducted their household devotions to the royal family. One of the most striking discoveries of the Amarna Project has been the so-called South Tombs Cemetery, a burial ground for the ordinary inhabitants of the city, located in the desert south of the central residential district. The cemetery was excavated systematically beginning in the early 2000s. It contained the remains of more than 400 individuals, buried in shallow graves with minimal funerary equipment. The skeletons showed, on examination, extensive evidence of physical stress. The bodies were short and thin. The bones showed signs of malnutrition. The vertebrae of the lower back showed extensive damage from heavy lifting, consistent with the requirements of the rapid construction of the city. The teeth showed signs of severe wear and frequent dental disease. Many of the buried individuals had died young, between the ages of 15 and 30, of conditions that the modern excavators have attributed to a combination of overwork, undernourishment, and exposure to disease in the crowded conditions of the new capital. The picture that emerges from the South Tombs Cemetery is of a city that was built quickly, at enormous human cost, by a population that was being driven hard. The grand religious experiment at the top of the social pyramid was being paid for, at the bottom of the pyramid, by the bodies of the workers who had constructed the temples and the palaces and who had not lived long enough to see the city completed. What has not held up is any easy answer to the question of where the queen was buried. The royal tomb at Amarna contained chambers prepared for her, but those chambers were empty. The chambers in the central city that might have served as a temporary depository for her body, while her permanent tomb was being prepared, have not been identified. The unfinished tombs in the wadis east of the city have not produced any royal material that can be attributed to her. The conclusion that some scholars have drawn from this absence is that she was not buried at Amarna at all. She was buried, the argument goes, somewhere else, and her body was moved to that other location either during her lifetime, in anticipation of the dynasty's eventual abandonment of the heretical capital, or shortly after her death, by family members who knew that Amarna was not going to last, and who wanted to ensure that the queen's remains were placed somewhere more secure. If she was buried elsewhere, the most likely location is the Valley of the Kings, the traditional royal necropolis on the western bank of the Nile at Thebes. The valley contains the tombs of most of the pharaohs of the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties. It was used as a royal burial ground for roughly 500 years. The cliffs that enclose it were honeycombed with tomb cuttings, some of which were left unfinished, some of which were used by minor royal figures, some of which were used and then reused for later burials, and some of which were used as caches for the consolidation of bodies that had been moved from their original tombs during the disturbed conditions of the 21st dynasty. If Nefertiti was buried in the Valley of the Kings, her tomb has not yet been identified. The most thorough surveys of the valley, conducted over the last 150 years, have located and cataloged essentially every accessible tomb opening. None of the identified tombs contains a burial that can be securely attributed to her. Some of the unfinished or anonymous tombs in the valley have been proposed as possible candidates, but none has produced any positive evidence. One of the most disputed and most discussed sites in the valley is the small burial known by its modern catalog number as Tomb 55. It was discovered in 1907 by an expedition funded by the American lawyer and amateur Egyptologist Theodore Davis. The tomb was small, containing only a single chamber, and had been deliberately disturbed and partially defaced in antiquity. The contents were chaotic. There was a smashed wooden shrine originally made for Queen Tiye, the mother of Akhenaten. There were canopic jars whose original owner could not be securely identified. There was a coffin, badly damaged by water and by deliberate destruction, in which the face panel had been deliberately hacked off, and the cartouches containing the original owner's name had been carefully chiseled away. Inside the coffin lay a partial skeleton. The identification of the body and of the original owner of the coffin has been argued for over a century. The current consensus, supported by the DNA analysis of 2010, is that the body is almost certainly Akhenaten himself, or a closely related male member of the royal family. The coffin was probably made originally for someone else, possibly for a royal woman, possibly Nefertiti's daughter Meritaten, possibly the elusive Smenkhkare. It was reused for the male burial. The body was probably moved to Tomb 55 from its original burial at Amarna during the cleanup operations conducted under Tutankhamun or shortly afterward, when the royal remains of the heretical period were being relocated from the abandoned capital to safer locations in the Valley of the Kings. The Tomb 55 burial is important because it suggests that at least one body from the Amarna royal family was successfully moved from Amarna to the valley. If one body could be moved, others could have been moved as well. The body of Nefertiti, if her burial existed and if her remains were considered worth saving, might have been moved at the same time. If she was, then her body might be in the valley somewhere, in a chamber that has not yet been identified, or in one of the anonymous bundles in one of the royal caches that were assembled during the 21st dynasty. The royal cache at Deir el-Bahri, discovered in 1881 by the Egyptian Antiquities Service and including the bodies of many of the great pharaohs of the New Kingdom, was assembled during the 21st dynasty as a defensive measure against tomb robbery, which had become endemic in the valley after the collapse of central authority at the end of the New Kingdom. The cache contained the bodies of, among others, Seqen-enre-Tau, Amenhotep I, Thutmose II, Thutmose III, Seti I, Ramesses II, and many others, all of them rewrapped and relabeled by the priests who carried out the consolidation. The cache did not include any body explicitly labeled as Nefertiti. It also did not include any body explicitly labeled as Akhenaten, which is consistent with the historical situation, given that the heretical pharaohs were not generally considered legitimate by the 21st dynasty priesthood. It is possible, though not provable, that some of the unlabeled bodies in the cache might include members of the Amarna royal family whose identities had been deliberately suppressed. A second royal cache, found in Tomb 35, the tomb of Amenhotep II, in 1898, included a number of additional royal mummies, again rewrapped and relabeled during the 21st dynasty consolidation. This is the cache that contained, in a side chamber, the bodies known as the Elder Lady, the Younger Lady, and the Unidentified Boy. The elder lady has been identified, with high confidence, as Queen Ta. The boy has been variously identified, but the most common hypothesis is that he was a son of Amenhotep II, who died in childhood. The younger lady remains the contested figure. She is the only female body in any of the royal caches whose age, condition, and apparent royal status are consistent with an identification as Nefertiti. The body of the younger lady is in poor condition. She is approximately 5 feet 2 inches tall, which is consistent with the average height of Egyptian women of the period. Her age at death has been estimated, on the basis of dental wear and bone development, at somewhere between 25 and 35 years. The most distinctive feature of her remains is the damage to her face. The nose has been smashed flat, the upper lip and the front of the maxilla have been broken away. The damage is not consistent with normal postmortem decay. It appears to have been inflicted deliberately, either shortly before death or shortly after death, by a blunt instrument, or by repeated blows from some weapon. The reason for the damage is unknown. It is possible that she was killed by a blow to the face. It is possible that she was already dead when the damage was inflicted, and that it was done as a form of ritualized disfigurement, perhaps to deny her the use of her face in the afterlife. The disfigurement of the dead by deliberate damage to the face was a known Egyptian practice, used in cases where the deceased was considered an enemy of the state or where the survivors wished to deny the deceased a continued existence in the next world. If the damage to the younger lady's face was a deliberate ritual mutilation, it would be consistent with the broader pattern of erasure inflicted on the Amarna royal family in the years after the fall of the city. The hands of the younger lady are also damaged. The right arm is missing entirely. The left arm is present, but severely damaged. The position in which the surviving arm rests on the body, with the hand crossed over the chest, has been the subject of some discussion, because this position is associated, in some Egyptian funerary traditions, with the burial of a queen rather than a princess or a private woman. The argument is suggestive but not conclusive. Different scholars have read the surviving arm position differently. The lack of the right arm makes any firm conclusion impossible. The DNA analysis of 2010, which examined the younger lady alongside Tutankhamun and several other 18th dynasty mummies, concluded that the younger lady was the biological mother of Tutankhamun and that she was also a daughter of Amenhotep III and Queen Ta. This conclusion, if accepted, would mean that the younger lady was a full sister of Akhenaten. It would also mean that she was almost certainly not Nefertiti, who was not generally believed to have been a sister of Akhenaten, though as already noted, the close family marriages of the period make even this question complicated. The DNA results have been challenged on technical grounds. The extraction of usable DNA from ancient Egyptian mummies is notoriously difficult because the desiccating conditions of mummification tend to fragment the genetic material into very short segments that are difficult to read. The risk of contamination from modern handlers is high. The published study used relatively small sample sizes and did not, at the time, have its results independently replicated. Subsequent reanalysis by other teams has produced mixed conclusions, with some teams supporting the original findings and others questioning them. The status of the younger lady, as of the present writing, remains contested. She may be Nefertiti, she may be a different royal woman, possibly a sister of Akhenaten whose name has not been preserved. The available evidence does not permit a confident decision. If she is not Nefertiti, then Nefertiti is somewhere else. The candidates are limited. The royal tomb at Amarna has been excavated. The cliffs east of Amarna have been surveyed. The Valley of the Kings has been combed. The known royal caches have been examined. The areas that remain unexamined are areas that, by their nature, would be difficult to examine. These include the unfinished and unexcavated portions of certain tombs in the valley, the possibility of as yet undiscovered chambers in tombs that have already been entered, and the possibility of intact royal tombs in less explored areas of the Theban necropolis or in other royal burial grounds elsewhere in Egypt. It was the hypothesis that her tomb might still exist, undiscovered, behind the walls of an already entered tomb that gave rise, in 2015, to the most public and controversial chapter in the modern search for Nefertiti. The English Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves, then a research scholar affiliated with the University of Arizona, published a paper in which he argued that the tomb of Tutankhamun, The famous Tomb 62, discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, was not the original tomb of Tutankhamun. It was, Reeves argued, an older and larger tomb, originally prepared for someone else, that had been hurriedly partitioned and repurposed for Tutankhamun when he died unexpectedly at a young age. The original occupant, Reeves further argued, had been Nefertiti. Her body, he believed, was still in the back chambers of the tomb, separated from Tutankhamun's burial chamber by a plastered and painted wall. The argument was based on a careful study of the high-resolution scans of the painted walls of Tomb 62 that had been produced by the Madrid-based facsimile workshop Factum Arte as part of a project to create an exact replica of the tomb for the purpose of relieving tourist pressure on the original. The Factum Arte scans were so detailed that they captured features of the painted plaster that were not visible to the naked eye. Reeves, examining these scans over a period of several months, noticed faint linear features beneath the painted decoration of the north wall and the west wall of the burial chamber. The features appeared to follow geometric patterns consistent with the presence of sealed doorways. Reeves became convinced that there were two hidden chambers behind the walls of Tomb 62, and he developed a hypothesis about the original layout of the tomb and the identity of the original occupant. The hypothesis was elegant. It explained certain otherwise puzzling features of Tutankhamun's burial. The tomb of Tutankhamun was, by the standards of pharaonic tombs in the Valley of the Kings, unusually small. It consisted of an antechamber, a burial chamber, an annex, and a treasury, all crammed together in a compact arrangement that was clearly not the original conception of a royal tomb. The mortuary equipment was lavish, but much of it appeared to have been hurriedly prepared or repurposed from other contexts. Several of the most important pieces, including the second of the three nested coffins, bore inscriptions that had clearly been altered to substitute Tutankhamun's name for an earlier name that had been chiseled out. The face on this second coffin, while clearly intended to represent a king, does not closely resemble the face on the inner coffin, which is generally accepted as a portrait of Tutankhamun himself. Reeves argued that the second coffin had been originally made for someone else, probably Nefertiti in her capacity as pharaoh, and had been repurposed when she was displaced from her own tomb to make room for Tutankhamun's hasty burial. The geometric features Reeves had identified in the Factum Arte scans, he argued, were the outlines of the sealed doorways through which Nefertiti's body had been moved into the rear chambers when the tomb was partitioned. The plaster and paint that now covered those doorways had been applied during the partitioning process to disguise the presence of the original passages. Behind those doorways, Reeves hypothesized, lay the original burial of Nefertiti, undisturbed since the time it had been sealed up, possibly containing intact funerary equipment, and possibly the body of the queen herself. The hypothesis attracted enormous public attention. The Egyptian government, then headed by the Minister of Antiquities Mamdouh el-Damati, authorized an investigation. The first phase used infrared thermography, in which the walls of the burial chamber were imaged with thermal cameras to detect any temperature differentials that might indicate the presence of empty space behind the painted plaster. The results, announced in November of 2015, suggested that there were anomalies. Certain areas of the walls were measurably cooler than the surrounding stone, which was consistent with the presence of air-filled cavities behind them. The minister told the press that the early evidence supported the Reeves hypothesis. The second phase, conducted at the end of November 2015 by the Japanese radar specialist Hirokatsu Watanabe, used ground-penetrating radar to scan the walls in more detail. Watanabe reported, with high confidence, that he had detected the presence of two hidden chambers behind the walls of the burial chamber, one behind the north wall and a smaller one behind the west wall. The minister, citing Watanabe's report, announced at a press conference that the scan showed a 90% likelihood of hidden chambers. The international press reported the announcement as a near confirmation of the Reeves hypothesis. There was widespread anticipation that Nefertiti's tomb was about to be found. The third phase, conducted in March and April of 2016 by a team from the National Geographic Society, used a different ground-penetrating radar system, with different operators and different settings. The results were ambiguous. The team reported that they could not detect the anomalies that Watanabe had reported. The scans did not show clear evidence of hidden chambers. The discrepancy between the two surveys raised serious questions about the reliability of the radar methodology in this particular context, where the walls of the tomb were thick and irregular and the surrounding stone was variably fractured. The Egyptian government, now embarrassed by the conflicting results, decided to commission a third and more definitive investigation. The third survey, conducted in February of 2018 by an Italian team from the University of Turin using multiple radar systems with very high spatial resolution, found no evidence of hidden chambers at all. The team's report was unambiguous. There were no anomalies behind the walls of the burial chamber that were consistent with the presence of sealed doorways or empty cavities. The Reeves hypothesis, on the basis of the third survey, appeared to be refuted. Reeves and his supporters did not accept the refutation. They argued that the three surveys had used different methodologies and had reached different conclusions, which suggested that the radar evidence was simply too noisy to support any firm conclusion either way. They continued to press for additional investigations. A fourth survey, conducted in 2020 by another team using different equipment, again produced ambiguous results, with some readings suggesting the presence of a previously undetected linear feature, possibly a corridor running parallel to the burial chamber at a depth of several meters behind the north wall. The fourth survey's results were less dramatic than the original Watanabe report, but were not consistent with the negative conclusion of the third survey. In 2025, at the 4th Annual International Tutankhamun Conference held at the Grand Egyptian Museum near Giza, a statement was released on behalf of Mostafa Waziri, the Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities. The statement reported that the cumulative evidence from all of the surveys, taken together, did not support the existence of hidden chambers adjacent to Tomb 62. The investigation that had begun in 2015 was, in the official view of the Egyptian authorities, concluded there were no chambers, there was no hidden burial. Nefertiti was not behind the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb. The official conclusion did not end the debate, but it removed most of the public momentum. Subsequent commentary on the Reeves hypothesis has tended to treat it as an interesting but ultimately unproven speculation. The body of Nefertiti, if it survives, is presumably somewhere else. The active candidates have been narrowed back to the younger lady from Tomb 35, and to the possibility of an undiscovered tomb somewhere in the Theban necropolis or in some other royal burial ground that has not yet been systematically examined. The work continues. Excavations at Amarna are ongoing, conducted under the direction of the Amarna Project, an English archaeological program that has been working at the site continuously since the late 1970s. The project has not, to date, identified the Queen's burial. Excavations elsewhere in Middle Egypt continue to produce occasional surprises. New tombs are still being discovered. Old assumptions are still being revised. The possibility that the Queen will be found in some location that no one has yet thought to investigate remains real. The most active current effort to locate any major missing royal burial of the late dynastic period is the work of the Dominican archaeologist Kathleen Martinez at the temple complex of Taposiris Magna on the Mediterranean coast, about 45 kilometers west of Alexandria. Martinez has been excavating at the site since the early 2000s, working on the hypothesis that the tomb of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, might be located beneath the temple. Martinez's work is not directly aimed at Nefertiti, but her excavations have produced significant discoveries, including a previously unknown subterranean tunnel system, and have demonstrated that important royal material can still be recovered from sites that were previously assumed to have been exhausted. The model of slow, patient, hypothesis-driven excavation that Martinez represents is the kind of work that, applied to the question of Nefertiti, might eventually produce results. Zahi Hawass, the longtime senior figure in Egyptian archaeology and a frequent commentator on the Nefertiti question, has continued throughout the 2010s and 2020s to advance hypotheses about the location of the Queen's tomb. Hawass has at various points suggested that the tomb might be located in the Valley of the Kings, possibly in the area between Tomb 62 and the nearby tomb of Ramesses VI, where a survey he led in 2017 and 2018 examined a previously unexplored area of the valley floor. The survey produced suggestive results, but did not identify a clear tomb opening. Subsequent work in the area has continued intermittently. As of the present, no positive identification has been made. The English Egyptologist Aidan Dodson, one of the leading authorities on the genealogy and the burial practices of the 18th dynasty, has argued in a series of publications that the most likely location of Nefertiti's burial is the royal tomb at Amarna itself, in one of the chambers that was prepared for her, but that has subsequently been disturbed and emptied. Dodson's argument is that her body was probably removed from Amarna at the time of the city's abandonment, along with the bodies of Akhenaten and the daughters, and that it was probably reburied in the Valley of the Kings, possibly in Tomb 55, or in a nearby tomb that has subsequently been re-emptied. Dodson does not believe that the younger lady from Tomb 35 is Nefertiti. He has argued, on stylistic and genealogical grounds, that the younger lady is more likely a previously unidentified sister of Akhenaten, whose name has been lost to the record. His position, like that of every other major scholar on the question, is provisional and depends on the available evidence, which is incomplete. The French Egyptologist Marc Gabolda, another leading authority on the Amarna period, has argued in his own series of publications that Nefertiti probably was the pharaoh Neferuten, and that she ruled briefly after Akhenaten's death before being displaced by the rise of the boy king Tutankhamun. Gabold has been more open than some of his colleagues to the possibility that the younger lady might in fact be Nefertiti, although he too treats the question as unresolved. Gabolda's broader work on the Amarna period has emphasized the political and dynastic significance of the queen's role, arguing that she was a central figure in the religious revolution of the period, and that her eventual displacement and erasure was a deliberate political act by the Theban establishment that took power after the dynasty's collapse. The work of these scholars and others continues. New papers appear in the academic literature each year. New excavations open at new sites. New radar surveys are conducted with new equipment. The search has not been abandoned. It has simply settled into a slower, less publicly visible mode in which the spectacular announcements of the previous decade have given way to the patient accumulation of incremental evidence. The body has not been found. The body may not be findable. The possibility remains open that it will be found tomorrow, or next year, or in another century, or never. The persistence of the search has, in itself, become a kind of historical phenomenon worthy of attention. The chiselers who climbed the ladders at the temples of the Aten in the years after the fall of the dynasty had been carrying out a fairly straightforward political program. They wanted the heretical queen to be forgotten. They wanted her face removed from the public spaces of the kingdom. They wanted her name unspoken. They wanted, in the end, to produce a condition in which no one alive could recall that she had ever existed. That program, as a political project, had a finite goal. It was supposed to succeed within a few generations. The names of the heretical pharaohs would fade from common knowledge. The temples of the disk would be demolished and forgotten. The abandoned city in the desert would gradually be reclaimed by the sand. Within 2 or 3 centuries, no one in Egypt would have any reason to think about the woman whose face had been so carefully scraped from the walls. The program succeeded, on its own terms, for a very long time. For roughly 3,000 years, from the closing decades of the 18th dynasty down to the early 19th century of the modern era, the woman called Nefertiti was almost entirely forgotten. Her name survived in a few inscriptions that were embedded inside the foundations of later walls, where no one could see them. Her face survived in fragments of plaster that were buried in the sand of an abandoned workshop, where no one would think to look for them. The city she had helped to build survived as a low mound of ruined mud brick on the eastern bank of the Nile, where the local villagers occasionally dug for fertilizer, but where no one with any interest in history had set foot for many centuries. The program failed, in the end, only because the modern world chose to reverse it. The recovery of the heretical period from the silence in which it had been buried was an act of deliberate scholarly reconstruction, undertaken by Europeans and Egyptians in the 19th and 20th centuries who decided, on their own initiative, that the erasure carried out by Horemheb and Ramesses II was no longer to be respected. They went back into the foundations of the later walls. They extracted the buried Talatat blocks. They reassembled the wall scenes. They excavated the abandoned city. They photographed the rock-cut tombs. They translated the boundary stelae. They reconstructed, in painstaking detail, the world that the ancient erasers had attempted to make unreconstructible. The face that the chiselers had scraped from the walls of the temples emerged, eventually, from a sand-filled workshop in a planned city that had been abandoned by its inhabitants in a hurry 33 centuries earlier. The body that the chiselers had presumably failed to find or had failed to destroy, depending on which reconstruction is accepted, is still somewhere in some chamber or some cache, waiting to be found by the modern excavators who have been looking for her for the last 150 years. The modern search is, in a particular sense, the inverse of the ancient erasure. The hands that scraped her name from the stones in the years after the fall of the dynasty have been answered by the hands of the archaeologists who are now scanning the walls of nearby tombs with radar, sifting the soil of the abandoned city for fragments of plaster, and extracting DNA from the desiccated bodies of unlabeled mummies in the hope that one of them will turn out to be hers. The reversal is not yet complete. The body has not been found. The exact circumstances of her death have not been established. The full story of her reign, if she had a reign, has not been reconstructed. But the silence that was supposed to be permanent has been, in many of its specifics, partially broken. The face is famous. The name is universal. The city has been excavated. The boundary stelae have been read. The hymn has been translated. The political history of the period has been mapped out to a degree that the original erasers could not have anticipated. What the chiselers wanted to undo has, over the last 150 years, been progressively redone until the heretical queen is now almost as well known to modern readers as she was to the inhabitants of Amarna at the height of her power. What is certain is that the queen herself is not gone. She is missing, but she is not gone. Her face, in the workshop bust now in Berlin, is one of the most recognized images in the world. Her name is in every history book, in every museum guide, on every brochure handed out at the door of every Egyptology exhibit. The chiselers who climbed the ladders at the temples of the Aten, more than 3,300 years ago, with their orders to remove her image from the stone, did not succeed in removing her from the world. They succeeded only in producing a long silence at the center of her story, a silence that has lasted from the 12th year of her husband's reign down to the present, and that may never be fully broken. The silence is the inheritance she left behind. It is the most fully developed silence in the history of human memory. It surrounds her like a shell. The face is visible, the name is spoken, but the woman herself, the actual physical person who breathed the air of Amarna and stood beneath the open roof of the great Aten temple at dawn and held her dying daughter in her arms in the closing years of the heretical capital, that woman is not findable. The bronze chisels that scratched at her cartouches 3,000 years ago worked in their way. They did not remove her, but they removed the means by which she could be approached. They left the world a face without a body, a name without a grave, a memory without a presence. It is possible to stand at the edge of the abandoned city, on a clear winter morning when the light is at the right angle and the sand has settled along the line of the ancient main avenue, and to look down the length of the place where the great Aten temple once stood, where the king and the queen once walked together in the early hours with the rays of the disk falling across their shoulders, and to feel the absence of her in the way the wind moves across the empty ground. The temple is gone, the palace is gone, the workshops are gone, the houses of the courtiers are gone. The boundary stelae still stand in the cliffs at the edges of the territory, but their inscriptions have been worn by 3,000 years of weather, and the names that they recorded are now barely legible. The city that was supposed to last forever lasted for less than 30 years. The dynasty that founded it lasted only a few decades longer. The religion they built around themselves disappeared within a generation. The world they tried to create was disassembled, piece by piece, by the hands of people who came after them and who wanted to forget that any of it had ever existed. But it had existed, and one of the central figures in it had been a woman whose face we still see, and whose name we still know, and whose body we still cannot find. The search is not over. The story is not finished. As long as there are archaeologists working at Amarna, and at the Valley of the Kings, and at sites along the Mediterranean coast, and in the laboratories where the DNA of the disputed mummies is being tested and retested, the possibility remains that someone, eventually, will find her. The wall that was supposed to seal her in is no longer holding. The chisels that were supposed to remove her did not finish the job. The silence that surrounds her is not absolute. It can still, in principle, be broken. For now, she remains where she has been for the last 33 centuries. She is in Berlin, in the painted limestone bust on the upper floor of the Neues Museum. She is in the cliffs east of the abandoned city, in the inscriptions of the boundary stele that her husband cut into the stone as a promise of a kingdom that was supposed to last forever. She is in the fragments of plaster recovered from the workshop of Thutmose, the unfinished portraits, and the broken heads that were left behind when the artisans fled the dying capital. She is in the academic journals where her tomb is debated. She is in the radar scans that have not yet conclusively answered the question of what lies behind the painted walls of her successor's burial chamber. She is in the slow, patient excavations that continue year after year at the edges of the old city and in the wadis of the eastern desert and in the valley across the river from Thebes. She is everywhere her enemies tried to remove her from. She is the queen who was supposed to vanish and who did not. Thank you for spending this time with Vaulted World Secrets. The history of ancient Egypt remains full of mysteries that have not yet been fully understood, and the story of the woman whose face the world remembers and whose grave the world cannot find is among the most persistent of them. If you found yourself drawn to histories like this one, consider subscribing. There are many more stories yet to come. If the chiselers had truly succeeded, if every trace had been removed and every memory wiped, what other queens of Egypt might have stood beside their pharaohs in the same way, and whose names will we never know? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Until next time, rest well.